The shop is closed tonight. The counter is dark. The candle is unlit. The jars are where they always are, waiting on their shelves in the usual silence. But I am not there. I am here. Out in the open, under this sky, I am Master Aldworth, apothecary, 40 years behind a counter, and tonight, for the first time in some while, I have left it. There are plants that belong in jars, dried and labeled and dispensed across a wooden counter in measured amounts, most of them, if I'm honest. And then there is Vervain. Vervain has always insisted on being gathered like this, at night, under open sky, at a particular hour that belongs neither to yesterday nor to tomorrow. The Druids knew this, the Romans knew it. The Egyptian priests who called it the Tears of Isis knew it long before either of them. You do not simply buy Vervain from a merchant's cart. You do not send an apprentice to fetch it in the afternoon. You come yourself. You come at the right hour. You come when the dog star is rising and neither the sun nor the moon is visible in the sky. You come, in other words, to a place very much like this one. Tonight we shall follow this plant through 4,000 years of recorded history, through the temple rituals of Greece and Rome and Egypt, through Druidic groves and medieval monasteries, and the grimoires of Renaissance practitioners, through the village healers and the court physicians, through Dioscorides and Hildegard and Culpeper, through the nervous system and the liver and the ancient human instinct that some plants require ceremony. We shall learn why every civilization that encountered Vervain decided it was sacred, and why the science that finally caught up with it found the tradition had been right all along. This is not a short story. I am an old man and I do not rush. But then you did not come out into this dark field for something rushed. You came because it is late and something in you wanted to slow down, and perhaps because you sensed rightly that there are things only visible in this quality of darkness. That is the right instinct. Vervain rewards it. Settle in then. Find your comfortable position. The night is clear. The stars are doing their proper work overhead. We have hours ahead of us, and a plant of extraordinary patience, waiting to be understood. Before we begin in earnest, I would ask one small favor. If you find yourself glad you stepped out into this field tonight, tell someone. A like, as they call it, a subscription to the channel. These things are how other tired souls find their way here. One quiet recommendation, passed along like a harvest instruction, whispered from teacher to student, like a remedy shared across a garden wall. And I am genuinely curious. Leave a word in the comments when you are able. Tell me where you have traveled from to stand in this field tonight. What city, what country, what corner of the world finds itself awake at this hour, or settling towards sleep? I read everyone. It has become, over time, one of my favorite things about keeping this work going. Someone in Kyoto at sunrise, someone in Sao Paulo in the afternoon, someone in Edinburgh with the rain doing exactly what Edinburgh rain does. All of us gathered here in a dark field under the same stars that guided every hand that ever gathered this plant before ours. That is a remarkable thing when you consider it. Now then, let us begin. The night is clear tonight. That is fortunate. Vervain wants to be gathered under open sky with the stars overhead and the dew not yet heavy on the leaves. There is a reason we are out here in the dark rather than behind the counter with a candle. Some plants earn their history indoors, pressed into jars and ledgers. Vervain earned its history out here, in fields like this one, under skies like this one. Walk carefully through this next patch. The stems are thin and easy to miss underfoot. I want to tell you where this plant comes from, not in the botanical sense. We will come to roots and leaves and flower spikes in good time. I mean, the deeper question, where does a plant come from when a civilization looks at it and decides it is sacred? The Egyptians had an answer, and it was not a modest one. They believed Vervain was born from the tears of Isis herself. Grief made visible, made botanical. The story is this: Isis wept for Osiris, her husband, her king, the god who had been murdered and scattered across the world, and where those tears fell upon the earth, Vervain grew. There is something remarkable about that origin story when you sit with it. They did not say Vervain was useful to Isis. They said Vervain was made of her, grown from her sorrow, from her love, from the most sacred grief in their entire cosmology. This was not a plant to be taken lightly. And they did not take it lightly. Vervain appeared in their processions. It was laid on altars as an offering. Not because it was exotic. Egypt knew exotic plants, traded for them across great distances, but because something in Vervain, its bitterness perhaps, or its strange persistence, or simply its association with that story, marked it as belonging to another order of things. They called it the Tears of Isis. 3 words that tell you everything about how the Egyptians thought. A plant does not merely grow, it arrives. It arrives from somewhere, from someone, for a reason. The purification rites used Vervain specifically because of this. When something needed to be made clean, an altar, a space, a person moving through a difficult time, you reach for the plant that carried the goddess's tears. The logic is exact. If Isis herself, in her grief, had blessed this ground with her weeping, then what grew from that weeping carried something of her intention: healing, protection. The slow, patient work of restoration. Now look here. This stem, you can see the tiny flowers along it, still closed at this hour. They will not open until morning. Another thing Vervain does on its own schedule: run your fingers along the leaves gently. The texture is slightly rough, almost bristled, not the soft velvet of chamomile, not the smooth authority of sage, something more guarded, a plant that has learned to ask something of you before it gives. The Egyptians understood that kind of plant. They had a whole theology built around the idea that sacred things require approach. You do not simply take. You offer first, and so Vervain was offered on the altar in the procession before anything was asked of it in return. 40 years at this work, and I still find that instructive. The Egyptians were not alone in this. Every civilization that encountered Vervain seems to have arrived at the same instinct, that this plant belonged somewhere between the ordinary world and something else, that it occupied a threshold, a border, a place where the usual rules bent slightly. The Greeks felt it too, and they named that feeling precisely as Greeks tended to do. They dedicated Vervain to Eos Erigenia, the goddess of the dawn, not a war goddess, not a goddess of the harvest or the sea or the forge, the goddess of the moment between night and ending and day not yet begun, the goddess of the threshold itself. Think about what that dedication means. Dawn is not night, dawn is not day. Dawn is the moment when the world has not yet decided which it will be. It is the liminal hour, the in-between. And Vervain, in the Greek imagination, belonged to that hour. We are out here gathering now, because that tradition is older than most things we call ancient. The proper time to harvest Vervain, the time that herbalists and priests and cunning folk agreed on across centuries, was at a very specific moment, when the dog star rose, when Sirius climbed above the horizon, and crucially, when neither the sun nor the moon was visible in the sky. Not day, not night, not even moonlight to guide you. The threshold hour, the hour of Eos Erigenia, the hour that belonged to Vervain. I have gathered it this way since my father showed me how, and his teacher showed him, and somewhere behind all of them is a very long line of people, standing in dark fields holding small bundles of stems, waiting for exactly this quality of darkness. There is something the mind does in this kind of dark. The usual noise quiets. The categories loosen a little. Perhaps that is why the ancients chose this hour. Not purely for ritual theater, but because something in the human mind is genuinely more open at the threshold, more willing to receive what a plant might offer. Or perhaps I am simply an old man who has stood in enough dark fields to have developed a fondness for them. Either way, here we are. The Greeks did not keep Vervain only for philosophy and mythology. They put it to very practical sacred use. The temple of Zeus, the great god, the thunder bearer, the father of the Olympians, was purified with Vervain. Not incense alone, not water. The altars of Zeus were swept and cleansed with this plant. The very floors where the most powerful god in their cosmology was worshipped, cleaned with these small, rough-leafed stems. That is a remarkable level of trust to place in a plant. And then there were the heralds in the ancient world. A herald was a particular kind of person. They crossed between armies, they entered enemy cities, they carried messages into places where any other man would have been killed on sight. Their safety depended entirely on their status being recognized and honored. Greek heralds carried vervain as their sacred bough during peace negotiations. Not laurel, not olive. That other famously peaceful plant, vervain, the threshold plant, the dawn plant, the one that belonged to the in-between. It makes a kind of sense that you would carry it into negotiations, into those difficult conversations where war and peace have not yet decided which they will be, where the outcome remains in the liminal space between possibility and catastrophe. Vervain was the plant you brought with you into those moments. For protection, for the signal it sent, and perhaps for what it represented about the nature of thresholds, that they can be crossed, that they need not become walls. Now step north with me in imagination, very far north, far enough that the gods change their names and carry hammers instead of lightning bolts. The Scandinavians had their own relationship with this plant, and it ran, as so many things did in the Norse world, through Thor. Thor's worshippers wove vervain into their ceremonies, used it in their mystical rites. The plant that the Greeks had given to the goddess of dawn, the Norse gave to the god of thunder and storms. The same small purple lilac flowers. Entirely different sky. And they had a story for those flowers, a very Norse story. The color of vervain's bloom, that particular shade of lilac, soft and persistent, they said was made by lightning. That Thor's strikes had touched the plant and left that color behind. A permanent mark of the god's attention. Look at the flowers on this stem. Even now, even in this darkness, you can make out that color. Pale, almost blue, almost purple. It does not announce itself the way a poppy does or a rose. It is subtle, more of a suggestion than a declaration. The Norse would say that subtlety is the mark of a very powerful thing that has no need to shout. And there is something consistent across all of this. Egypt, Greece, Scandinavia, 3 civilizations, 3 cosmologies, 3 entirely different sets of gods, and all 3 looked at vervain and arrived at the same conclusion. This plant belongs to something larger than itself. It carries weight, it marks thresholds. It should be handled with attention and with ceremony. They could not have compared notes. They were separated by distance and by centuries in some cases, and yet the instinct was identical. That kind of agreement, reached independently, is something I have learned to pay very close attention to. When healers across different traditions observe the same thing in a plant without consulting one another, it is rarely coincidence. The plant is telling you something. You only have to be willing to stand in the dark field long enough to hear it. There is something worth pausing on before we move further. We have been using the word vervain all evening as though it is simply a name, a label, something we put on the plant to distinguish it from the next plant on the shelf. But names carry history, and this particular plant's names carry more history than most. The Latin word verbena did not begin as the name of a specific plant. It was a category, a designation. It meant sacred bough, sacred foliage, the kind of greenery that was cut and carried and offered in ritual, the kind that you brought before the gods when you needed something from them or wished to honor them. Vervain was not the only plant that qualified. But over time, as the word moved through centuries of use, it narrowed. Other plants fell away from the designation. Vervain remained. The word contracted around it, like a title, earned rather than assigned. By the time the word reached us in its modern form, it had become this plants alone. A word that once described a whole class of the sacred had become the private name of one small species with thin stems and lilac flowers. That tells you something about how consistently vervain showed up in the rites. It did not simply qualify for the category, it came to define it. The Greeks made that designation explicit. They did not leave it to implication. They called vervain hierobotane. Two Greek roots pressed together into one word, hieros, sacred, botane, plant, the holy plant, not a holy plant among others, the holy plant, the one that held the category most fully. Think about how much is packed into that name. The Greeks named things with precision. They had words for very particular states of being, very particular qualities of experience. When they settled on hierobotane, they were not being casual. They were making a formal designation. This plant, above others, belongs to the sacred. The Romans received that designation and kept it. But they gave it their own formulation. Herba, sacra, sacred herb. The Latin carries a slightly different weight than the Greek. More official, more institutional, the Romans were a people who understood the relationship between religion and governance, between sacred rites and public order. Herba sacra sounds like something that would appear in an official document, a temple inventory, a priestly record. And, in a sense, it did. Roman religious practice was deeply formal. The correct performance of a rite mattered enormously. The right words said in the right order, the right offerings placed correctly, the right objects used. And before any of this could happen, the altar needed to be prepared. The sacred space needed to be made ready. Vervain was the instrument of that preparation. The boughs were cut, the altars were swept and cleansed with them, the shrines were blessed, and only then, with the space properly prepared, could the rite proceed. Vervain was not the ceremony itself. It was what made the ceremony possible, the first act, the threshold crossing. Again, the preparation of the in-between space, where the human and the divine might briefly meet. I find myself thinking about the priests who performed that work. They would have known this plant very well, known its smell when the leaves were bruised against the stone, known how the stems wore down with use, known how much you needed for a large altar versus a smaller one, known which time of year gave you the best growth, the most vigorous stems for the work. Practical knowledge accumulated through generations of practice, attached to a plant that carried the weight of the sacred. That combination is one I recognize. It is what good herbal knowledge always is, not mysticism alone, not cold utility alone, but the two held together, the understanding that this plant does specific things in the world, and that those specific things have meaning beyond themselves. Hierobotane, herba sacra, verbena. Three names, three formulations of the same recognition across Greek and Latin, across the centuries that separate those two great civilizations. The conclusion remains stable. This plant is set apart. This plant belongs to the work of making things sacred. We are walking now along the edge of where the older growth begins. The vervain here is taller, the stems woodier at the base. This is second or third year growth. See how the flower spikes are longer on these. More flowers per stem, more of those small lilac blooms that the Norse said Thor had touched with his lightning. The Greeks would have seen something else in them. The mark of Eos Erigenia, the color of the threshold hour, just before the light decides to arrive. It is the same flower, the same plant, the same lilac that barely announces itself in the dark, and it carried all of those names, all of those stories, all of that weight of meaning across cultures that never spoke to one another, across centuries that pile up into millennia when you stand back far enough to count them. There is a humility required when you stand in a field like this one, holding stems that people were calling holy before Rome existed, before Greece had built its temples, before most of what we call history had begun to accumulate. verbena. The word itself is a kind of inheritance. We received it from people who received it from people who received it from people whose other words we no longer know at all, who are gone so thoroughly that we have only the plant to remember them by. And the plant is still here, still growing along field edges and roadsides and riverbanks, still flowering in that same understated lilac, still bristling slightly under the fingers, still, if you are willing to stand in a dark field at the right hour, available to be gathered and used and understood. The name changed form across languages and centuries, but what the name pointed to did not change at all. That kind of continuity is worth something, I am not sure exactly what. But I have found, in 40 years of this work, that it is always worth paying attention to. The Romans, when they committed to something, committed thoroughly. We have spoken of herba sacra as a name, as a designation. But the Romans did not stop at naming. They built an entire infrastructure of practice around this plant. And when you look at the full picture of how Vervain moved through Roman life, what strikes you is how far it reached from the innermost sanctuaries to the outermost edges of the empire, from the priest at the altar to the soldier on the frontier. The same plant, carried in very different hands for reasons that were, at their root, the same reason. Begin in the temples. The Roman priest who prepared an altar for sacrifice or ceremony would have started with vervain. The boughs were used to sweep and cleanse the stone. Then the plant was burned. The smoke rising from it was understood to purify the air of the sanctuary, to prepare the space in both physical and spiritual terms for whatever rite was to follow. This is the reconciling work. The Romans had a particular preoccupation with the boundary between the physical and the sacred. Their religion was in many ways a science of thresholds, lairs and penates for the household, Janus for the doorway, the pontifex the bridge builder, as the title for the high priest himself, a civilization that thought constantly about what connects one realm to another. And vervain was the plant that did that connecting work, burned on the altars. Scattered across the sacred ground, used to prepare the space where mortal hands would reach towards something beyond the mortal. Consecrated, specifically, to Jupiter. That is worth sitting with, not a minor household deity, not a local spirit of a particular spring or grove. Jupiter, the king of the gods, the thunder bearer, the upholder of law and the cosmic arrangement of things. And vervain was his altar plant, the thing used to clean his table, to prepare the space where offerings to the highest god in the Roman pantheon would be placed. Pliny, the elder, wrote about it. Pliny was not a man given to exaggeration in the modern sense. He was a natural historian, cataloguing the world with the systematic attention of a man who understood that the world rewarded that kind of attention. And he wrote that vervain was used to cleanse Jupiter's table. He also noted what the Magi said about it. The Magi being the learned magical practitioners of the ancient world, men whose knowledge sat at the intersection of religion and medicine, and what we might cautiously call the esoteric. They claimed vervain could grant wishes, could banish fevers, could cure all diseases. Pliny recorded these claims faithfully. Whether he entirely believed them is another matter. He was a careful man, but he thought them worth recording. And in the history of a plant being thought worth recording by Pliny, the elder, is a considerable distinction. Now step outside the temple. Step out through the gates of Rome and onto the roads that stretch to every corner of the known world. Roman soldiers carried vervain, not in their physician's kit, though it was used medicinally, as we will come to, as a charm, as a protective talisman worn on the body or tucked into the equipment of a man who was going toward violence and hoped to return from it. Think about what that means practically. The Roman legions were the most disciplined military force the ancient world produced. These were not superstitious men in the simple sense. They were trained, organized, rational in their tactics and their engineering. And they carried sprigs of vervain, because rationality and the acknowledgement that some things lie beyond rational control are not in fact opposites. A soldier who has seen enough battles knows that skill and training and discipline are necessary, but not sufficient. There is a remainder, an unknown portion. And for that remainder, you reach for herba sacra. The peace envoys carried it too. We noted this with the Greek heralds. The Romans continued the tradition. Men entering enemy camps under flag of negotiation carried vervain boughs. The threshold plant, again, for the threshold moment, the conversation that might end a war or might end the speaker, depending on how it went. I have sometimes thought that this is the most revealing use of all. You carry the plant that belongs to the in-between into the most dangerous in-between imaginable. A Roman envoy walking into an enemy camp, neither safe nor condemned yet, carrying a plant that the enemy also recognized as sacred. That shared recognition across the battle lines was part of the protection. The plant as common ground, literally. And then there is the Verbainalia. The Romans gave Vervain its own festival, the Verbainalia, held in honor of Venus and the herb together. That pairing tells you something the temple records alone might not. Jupiter claimed Vervain for the high and formal sacred. Venus claimed it for something else, for desire, for devotion of a more personal kind, for the erotic and the tender and the fiercely wanting. A plant that could belong to both Jupiter and Venus is a plant of considerable range. The sacred and the passionate, the formal altar and the intimate dedication, the public ceremony and the private longing. Vervain moved between these without apparent contradiction, because at the deepest level, both are the same human reaching, both are the same acknowledgement that something matters, that you want something, that you are willing to make an offering toward it. The Romans understood this. Their religion was never purely abstract. It was always also about what people needed and feared and hoped for. And Vervain, herba sacra, consecrated to Jupiter and to Venus both, was equal to all of it. The ground here is softer. We are moving toward the lower edge of the field where the water runs closer to the surface. Vervain likes this, a little moisture, not standing water, just the memory of it in the soil. The stems down here are different. More supple, the leaves slightly broader, the same plant, adjusted to its particular circumstances, as plants do, as most living things do, given time enough to learn their ground. Hold this bundle a moment, while I mark where we are. We will want to come back to this patch. The Romans left us more than names and festival records. They left us Pliny's careful cataloguing. They left us temple records and military histories and the occasional personal letter that mentions, almost in passing, the use of this herb for this purpose. Scattered across centuries of documentation is this consistent thread, the same plant appearing in the higher sacred contexts and the most practical, everyday ones. That is what a truly useful plant looks like across history, not confined to one use or one class of person or one kind of need, available across the full range of human experience, from Jupiter's altar to a legionary's kit bag, from the Verbainalia's celebrations to the quiet daily work of keeping a household well. Herba sacra. In every context, still the sacred herb, still doing the work of connecting what is here to what is beyond here, whatever a given person understood that to mean. Pliny knew about the Druids. He wrote about them with the particular attention of a Roman encountering something that did not fit neatly into Roman categories, a priesthood without temples in the Roman sense, a sacred practice rooted entirely in living landscape, groves instead of sanctuaries, sky instead of ceiling. And he noted, carefully, that these people had very specific instructions about Vervain. The same instructions, in fact, that we are following tonight. Harvest at the rising of the dog star, when Sirius climbs above the horizon, and the condition that gives that timing its meaning, neither the sun nor the moon visible in the sky. The plant must never touch the light of either celestial body during the gathering. Not moonlight, certainly not sunlight, only starlight, only Sirius. If you are fortunate enough to have a clear sky, Pliny recorded this as the Druidic prescription. The Magi had their version, the Druids had theirs. They arrived separately at the same narrow window of time. The same quality of darkness, the same insistence that this particular plant required a particular kind of approach. I have wondered about that agreement many times. Two traditions, Rome and the Celtic world, not always on friendly terms with one another, arriving at identical harvesting instructions. You could say it is coincidence. You could say one tradition borrowed from the other. But the history suggests these practices ran in parallel, not in sequence. Both were already old by the time Pliny was writing them down. The more honest answer is probably the simplest one. Both traditions were paying close attention to the same plant, and the plant, in some sense, instructed them. Plants do not speak. I am not a mystical man in the theatrical sense, but a plant that flourishes in certain conditions, that yields its oils and its properties most fully at certain times, that has a relationship with light and temperature and moisture that affects what it contains. That plant, observed carefully across generations, will eventually teach you when to gather it. The ritual language is the accumulated wisdom of that observation, dressed in the clothing of its time. The Druids dressed it in very particular clothing. They called Vervain Druids weed, a possessive that says a great deal. Not a plant. The Druids used a plant that was theirs, that belonged to their practice in the way mistletoe belonged to it. And Salago and Samolus, these were the key ritual herbs, the ones that appeared at the most important moments of the ceremonial year. The ones handled with the most careful protocol. And the protocol for Vervain was strict. The gathering was done on moonless nights. August, when Sirius was rising, the plant, once cut, was placed immediately into iron containers, not touched with bare hands any longer than necessary. Not left in open air where the light might catch it. Iron specifically, a material the Druids understood to have its own properties, its own relationship with the supernatural world. Every detail of that protocol is intentional. Every constraint has a reason, even if the reason is now partly lost to us. The insistence on iron, the insistence on darkness, the specific star, these are not decorative. They are the accumulated instructions of a tradition that had been working with this plant long enough to have strong opinions about how it should be handled. We are using woven cloth tonight rather than iron. I will not pretend otherwise. But the darkness is correct. And Sirius, if you look just there, above the tree line to the southeast, is where it should be. Good. That is good. Once gathered, the Druids had specific uses in mind. The most fundamental was lustral water, holy water. In the terms we might use today, though the Druidic understanding of what made water holy was entirely their own. Vervain was prepared and infused into water that was then used for ritual cleansing, for the consecration of sacred spaces, for the purification of altars before ceremony. This is the same function we saw in Rome, the same preparation of the threshold space, but the Druidic version carried it further. The Vervain water was sprinkled through the groves before offerings, distributed through the living sacred space, not just across stone altars. The grove itself was the temple, and the temple needed to be made ready with this water, this plant, this particular quality of prepared intention. It also warded off malign spirits. The Druids had a very practical relationship with the unseen world. It was populated and active and not always friendly. Vervain in the water created a boundary, a perimeter of the properly sacred within which the ceremony could proceed safely. The same threshold logic, again. The in-between made navigable, the dangerous space made workable. Then there were the bards. Druidic tradition had a specific place for the poets. The bards were not simply entertainers, they were keepers of history, of genealogy, of the stories that held a community's understanding of itself together. Their gift was considered sacred. Their capacity to remember and to speak and to create meaning through language was understood as a kind of power that required tending. Vervain was used to anoint them, applied to the body as part of the rite of recognition, of opening, of the ceremony that marked a bard as someone whose words carried particular weight. It also appeared in what the tradition called Ceridwen's brew. Ceridwen is one of the great figures of Welsh mythology, the keeper of the cauldron of inspiration and knowledge. Her brew was the potion of Owen, of divine creative inspiration, and among its ingredients, Vervain, combined with primrose oils and other sacred materials into a preparation that was understood to open the channels of perception, to allow the bard or the seer to receive what was being offered from beyond the ordinary range of the senses. The Gauls used it for prophecy directly. Pliny recorded this too, fortune-telling, the reading of what was coming. Vervain as an aid to seeing across time, across the usual limits of perception. That is a significant claim, and I do not intend to adjudicate it here in a dark field. But I will say this: 40 years of working with plants has taught me that the line between the physiological and the perceptual is more permeable than we sometimes admit. A plant that genuinely calms the nervous system, that quiets the background noise of anxiety and tension, does in a real sense open perception, not to visions, not to prophecy in the dramatic sense, but to what was already there, waiting to be noticed beneath the noise. Perhaps that is what the Gauls were observing, a plant that made the seer quiet enough to see. Or perhaps there is more to it than that. I am old enough to hold the question without needing to resolve it. Pliny's writings did something important beyond mere documentation. They fixed the association. Later, antiquarians working through Roman sources to understand the Druidic world returned again and again to Pliny's account of Vervain. The plant became, in the written record, inseparable from Druidic practice, so thoroughly that by the time the early modern herbalists were writing their own accounts, Vervain's Celtic associations were simply assumed, part of its identity as a plant, as natural as its lilac flowers or its rough leaves. The Druids themselves left no written records. Their knowledge was transmitted through memory and voice and ceremony, the grove and the dark field and the careful hands in the particular hour. What we know of their relationship with Vervain comes through Roman eyes, filtered through Pliny and others who were observing from the outside. That is a limitation worth acknowledging. We are seeing the Druidic tradition through a particular lens, but what comes through even that lens is the unmistakable impression of a deep, careful, long-standing relationship with this plant, one that had developed its own protocols, its own language, its own understanding of what Vervain was for, and how it should be approached. The same plant that cleansed Jupiter's altar was gathered in dark Gaulish fields under Sirius and placed into iron, and used to prepare groves for ceremonies that Rome found strange and powerful and slightly frightening. Herba, sacra, hierobotane, Druids, weed. It accumulated names the way old things accumulate meaning. Each one a layer, each one a different civilization pressing its understanding into the same small plant and finding it capable of holding the weight. The field is quiet now. Even the small sounds have settled. This is the hour working as it should. Christianity arrived in Britain and Gaul and did what Christianity tended to do when it encountered a sacred plant already deeply embedded in the life of a place. It did not discard it. It reinterpreted it. This is worth understanding before we move into the specific legend. The early church was not naive about the plants people were already using, already revering, already gathering in dark fields under particular stars. To simply forbid them would have been to forbid something woven too deeply into the fabric of daily life to be easily removed. Better from a pastoral perspective to find the Christian meaning already present, to reframe rather than replace. With Vervain, they found a very powerful frame indeed. The legend runs like this: on Mount Calvary, at the crucifixion, after Christ was taken down from the cross, Vervain grew on that ground. And it was Vervain that was used to staunch his wounds. The plant that had cleansed Jupiter's altar and prepared Druidic groves now appeared at the central event of Christian history, doing what it had always done. The threshold work, the work of tending what is wounded at the most sacred moment. The names that followed from this legend are striking in their directness. Herb of the Cross, Holy Herb. And in Wales, where the older traditions ran deep, and the synthesis of Celtic and Christian thought produced its own distinctive flavor, Devil's Bane. That last name tells you something about how the legend was doing its work. It was not merely honoring the plant. It was actively repositioning it, a plant that had been used in Druidic ceremony. In pagan rites, in the preparation of spaces that the church might have considered dangerous or diabolical, was now recast as the plant that drove those very forces back. Devil's bane, the antidote to everything the older traditions had been accused of serving. The same plant turned to face a different direction. Medieval ointments containing Vervain were used specifically against demonic or spiritually caused illness because of the passion association, because of the claim that it had touched the wounds of Christ. Vervain carried a protective power against the forces understood to work against the soul. A physician who prepared such an ointment was working within a completely coherent logic. The plant had been present at the moment of redemption. It therefore carried something of that redemptive quality into the patient's body. You may find that logic strange from where we stand now. I do not. I have watched what belief does to the body often enough to have considerable respect for it. A patient who receives treatment in which they have deep faith recovers differently from one who does not, whether the mechanism is the plant, the faith, or the interaction between them, is a question that keeps better philosophers than me busy. What is clear is that the medieval synthesis worked. Vervain remained in use, remained in the apothecary's stock, remained gathered and prepared and administered. The Christian framing gave it new legs in a world where the old Druidic framing had become officially dangerous, and the harvesting rituals changed to reflect it. Not disappeared, changed. By the Elizabethan period, gatherers were still going out at particular times to harvest vervain with particular attention and ceremony. But the word spoken over it had shifted, where Druidic tradition had its protocols of darkness and iron and the rising of Sirius. The Elizabethan harvester chanted prayers, invocations of Calvary, words that connected the plant being cut from the ground to the wounds it had supposedly staunched on the hill outside Jerusalem. The structure of the ritual was identical to what came before. The moment of gathering marked by ceremony, by specific words, by the acknowledgement that this was not ordinary harvesting but something that required intention. What had changed was the language those intentions were clothed in. And there were charms specifically for what Vervain had always been asked to do: repel evil, protect the household, ward off malign influence. The Christianized charm gathered Vervain with prayers against evil, replacing the pagan harvest ritual so smoothly that in many communities the transition must have been almost invisible. The same grandmother's instruction to gather it at the right time, with the right words, for the right purpose, only the right words, had been updated. This is the pattern of Vervain through history. Not replacement, but accumulation. Each tradition adds its layer without entirely removing what came before. The Calvary legend did not erase the Druidic associations. It settled on top of them. The plant carried both, as it had carried the associations of Isis's tears and the dawn goddess and Thor's lightning before that. By the 19th century, when the occultists and antiquarians began their own systematic interest in the history of sacred plants, Vervain presented them with something extraordinary. A plant that had passed through every major spiritual tradition in the Western world without being owned entirely by any of them. Greek, Roman, Druidic, Christian, each had claimed it. Each had found it adequate to their claims, and it had survived the transition between them, not by abandoning its essential character, but by being broad enough, deep enough in its associations, to mean something within each new frame. The 19th century occultists were quite explicit about this. They highlighted Vervain as the plant that bridges high religious ritual and folk magic. The sacred and the practical, the official religion and the older, unofficial knowledge that continued running underneath it like groundwater. Vervain moved freely between those levels. It appeared in the most formal temple rites and in the most everyday household charms. It was consecrated to the highest gods, and carried by common soldiers. It was the herb of the cross, and the devil's bane and Druid's weed, and the tears of Isis all at once. No single tradition had managed to entirely flatten it into one meaning. There is a lesson in that, I think, about what makes a plant genuinely sacred rather than merely officially designated as such. The official designations come and go. Empires rise and their gods are superseded. Priesthoods are disbanded or transformed. What endures is something the plant demonstrates through its own consistent action across all of those changes. The Druid and the Elizabethan harvester and the Roman priest were all, at some level, responding to the same plant, the same properties, the same quality of presence. The stories they told about it were different. The names they used were different. The specific words spoken at the harvest were different. But the reaching toward it, the instinct that this plant required ceremony, required attention, required that you arrive at it with intention, rather than simply pulling it from the ground, as you might pull any other weed. That instinct was identical across all of them. We are doing the same thing tonight. I'm aware of that. We have our own frame for it, our own language, our own reasons for being out here at this hour rather than gathering in full daylight with no particular ceremony. But we are standing in a line that runs back through the Elizabethan fields and the Gaulish groves and the temples of Rome and the altars of Egypt to people whose names we do not know and whose languages we cannot speak. They all stood in a field like this one. They all reached for stems like these. The plant did not change. We changed around it. The great traditions leave records. Temple inscriptions, priestly texts, the writings of men like Pliny who made it their work to document what they observed. But most of human life does not happen in temples or in the writings of careful scholars. Most of human life happens in households, in villages, in the daily negotiation with illness and danger and the ordinary difficulties of being a body in the world. This is where Vervain's story becomes, in some ways, most interesting, because the plant did not stay in the temples. It came home with people. It moved out of the formal sacred spaces and into the practical daily life of ordinary men and women who needed it for ordinary urgent reasons. The Anglo-Saxons are our first clear window into that domestic life in Britain. They left us the leechdoms, medical texts, a word that comes from the Old English lace, healer, practical documents, lists of complaints and their treatments, instructions for preparation, what to use and how and when. Vervain appears in them for three things: plague, snakebite, evil spirits. That list tells you a great deal about how the Anglo-Saxons understood illness. The line between the physical and the supernatural was not, for them, the firm boundary we might draw today. Plague was a physical catastrophe, and also a visitation. Snakebite was a physical wound, and also a kind of malevolent contact with something dangerous in the natural world. Evil spirits caused illness that could not be explained by visible physical cause. Vervain addressed all three: as protective amulet, worn on the body, as medicinal preparation, applied or consumed, as apotropaic charm, placed in the household or carried against the threat. The distinction between those uses was not sharp. The same sprig of Vervain might be doing several kinds of work at once, and the Anglo-Saxon healer would not have found that confusing. The medical and the magical were not yet separated into different categories requiring different practitioners. The leechdoms were honest about this. They invoked the plant's sacred history. The Christian associations of the herb of the cross sat alongside the practical instructions for preparation. You gathered it correctly, you spoke the right words over it, you prepared it with attention, and then you used it. The ritual and the remedy were one continuous action. There was also a very specific Saxon belief about vervain and dogs. A sprig of vervain worn on the person would prevent dog bites. This sounds, from where we stand, like straightforward superstition. But dogs in the Anglo-Saxon world were not the domesticated companions we mostly know now. They were working animals, often half-wild, and a bite carried real danger of wound infection, and worse. The practical urgency behind that belief is real, even if the mechanism we would question. And a plant with genuine antimicrobial properties carried on the body used to clean wounds. The distance between the charm and the medicine is perhaps smaller than it first appears. Move west into Wales, and the tradition takes a more formally medical turn without entirely leaving the other behind. The physicians of Midfay are among the most remarkable figures in British herbal history, a family of healers from Carmarthenshire, their knowledge preserved across generations and eventually written down in the 13th century. Their texts represent a synthesis of classical humoral medicine, Arab scholarship, and something older and distinctly Welsh in its character. They use Vervain for swollen glands, a specific physical complaint. The approach was what they would have called cooling, working within the humoral framework that understood disease as imbalance between the body's qualities of heat, cold, moisture, and dryness. Swollen glands indicated excess heat, excess accumulation. Vervain, in their understanding, worked to reduce and resolve that accumulation. The Midfay physicians were not mystics. They were careful practitioners working within a coherent theoretical framework. Their use of Vervain was clinical in its intent, even if the framework it sat within is not ours, and that clinical use sat alongside the older Welsh understanding of the plant, as sacred, as powerful in ways beyond the purely physical. Welsh folk practice continued both streams at once. Vervain appeared in the churches, used to sprinkle holy water. The Druidic lustral water had become the Christian holy water, had become a practice still recognizably continuous with what came before. The same plant, the same act of sprinkling consecrated water to prepare a sacred space in a Welsh church rather than a Gaulish grove, but the gesture and the plant identical. And then there were the children. This is the detail that stays with me. Dried vervain leaves sewn carefully into a small silk bag worn around a sick child's neck. The care in that image. Someone sitting with a needle and silk, small careful stitches, enclosing the dried herb, tying it on a cord to hang at a child's throat. This is not a grand temple rite. This is a mother, or a grandmother, or a village healer, doing the only thing available to them for a child who was not recovering. The silk matters, not rough cloth, not linen. Silk, something better, something that itself signals that the contents are precious, that what is inside deserves the best wrapping available, that the child wearing it deserves the best protection available. This practice ran long. By the 19th century it was still documented, vervain amulets worn around children's necks as protection against infection. Centuries of mothers and healers maintaining that tradition, passing it from hand to hand, the specific instructions surviving because they worked well enough to be remembered and repeated. Sussex had its own version, powdered vervain in amulet cured childhood illness. The method slightly different, the intention identical, protect the child, use the plant that has always been used for protection. Trust the accumulated wisdom of the tradition, even if you cannot fully explain why it works. Sussex also held something darker about vervain, that it could, in the right hands, grant invisibility. This was witch country knowledge, the kind of claim that did not appear in the Leechtoms or the Midfay texts, but lived in the older, more underground current of folk practice. Vervain, as a plant of the liminal, extended to its logical conclusion. If it belonged to the threshold between states, to the in-between, then perhaps it could place a person in that threshold too. Neither fully present nor absent, visible and not. I am not going to tell you whether that claim is true. What I will tell you is that a plant credited with that kind of power across that many centuries is a plant that consistently impressed the people who worked with it, that consistently produced effects worth remembering and exaggerating and embedding in story. The invisible thread connecting all of these British uses, the Saxon Leechtom and the Welsh church and the silk bag sewn by firelight, and the Sussex witch's invisibility charm, is the same thread that connects back to Egypt and Greece and Rome and the Gaulish grove. This plant does something, it has always done something. The something shifts its description depending on the century and the culture and the framework available for understanding it. But the reaching toward it, the decision to use it at the important moments, for the urgent needs, for the children and the sick and the threatened, that has not changed in 4,000 years of recorded use. The stems here are particularly good, long, straight, the flower spikes intact. Gather these carefully, these will keep well. Here is a peculiarity worth examining. By the late medieval period, Vervain had accumulated so many sacred associations, so many centuries of use in formal religious contexts, that you might expect it to have settled into respectability. The herb of the cross, the plant that cleansed Jupiter's altar, herba sacra, a plant with those credentials, should have been entirely safe territory. And yet, the same centuries that preserved those credentials also embedded Vervain deeply in the world of sorcery and enchantment. Not despite its sacred history, because of it. This is the paradox that makes Vervain's story unlike almost any other plants. It was simultaneously a tool of witchcraft and a defense against witchcraft. The grimoires listed it as a plant of power for those who worked spells, and the same tradition, sometimes in the same text, noted that Vervain could hinder witches of their will, both at once, the weapon and the shield, the thing and its own antidote. How does a plant arrive at that position? The answer, I think, lies in what we have been tracing all evening. A plant understood across centuries to operate at thresholds, to carry genuine power, to move between the ordinary world and whatever lies beyond it. Such a plant does not belong exclusively to any one application of that power. It belongs to the power itself. And power can be directed in multiple directions, depending on the hand that holds it and the intention behind the holding. The folk magicians and the cunning folk and the village healers who worked in that difficult territory between official medicine and the older knowledge understood this perfectly. Their apothecaries routinely included Vervain for protective amulets, for love filters, for purging malevolent energies from a person or a household, for warding off evil of various kinds. The love charms are worth pausing on. We have seen Vervain associated with Venus in the Verbainalia. That erotic current ran forward through the centuries and surfaced here in the practical love magic of ordinary people who wanted what ordinary people have always wanted, to be loved, to bind the affections of someone they desired, to smooth the path toward the particular happiness that another person might provide. Vervain in a love filter was not arbitrary. It carried the weight of the Venusian association, the ancient understanding that this plant had something to do with desire and devotion and the reaching of one person toward another. The folk magician working with it was drawing on a very long tradition, even if she could not have traced its full history. The grimoires were more formal about it, those manuscript collections of magical instruction that circulated in learned circles, copied and recopied, annotated, and argued over, listed Vervain among the genuinely powerful protective herbs carried on the person. It deflected enchantments. It resisted hostile spells. A person wearing Vervain was harder to harm through magical means than a person without it. By the 19th century, this tradition had developed specific elaborations. Occult manuals described the pairing of Vervain with Mandragora, the most dramatic plant in the European magical tradition, with its human-shaped root and its violent mythology of uprooting screams and fatal sounds. Vervain combined with Mandrake for heightened magical protection. The two plants understood to amplify one another, to produce together something more powerful than either alone. That pairing tells you something about where Vervain sat in the hierarchy of the tradition. You do not pair an ordinary herb with Mandrake. You pair it with something considered its equal in significance. Vervain had that status, had earned it through the same long accumulation of use and association that we have been tracing all evening. Then there are the stranger claims, the ones that sit at the outer edge of the tradition, where the practical shades into something more difficult to categorize. Drinking Vervain tea was said to repel vampires and harmful nocturnal spirits. This is specifically a European strand of belief, distinct from the classical traditions, rooted in the particular anxieties of the medieval and early modern night. The night that contained real dangers, illness striking without visible cause, children sickening and dying. the vulnerability of sleep, and also the supernatural explanations that gave those dangers shape and name. Vervain, the threshold plant, the plant that had always been understood to mark and protect boundaries, extended naturally into the protection of the most vulnerable threshold of all, the boundary of sleep. The moment when consciousness recedes in the ordinary defenses of waking attention, go with it. You drank it before sleep. You closed that threshold behind you with a plant that had always been used to close and protect thresholds. The logic is entirely consistent with everything we have seen. And then the garden boundary, burying vervain at the edges of cultivated ground, was said to ensure abundant crops. Fertility drawn in, blight kept out. The same protective logic applied to the land itself. The threshold of the garden marked with the threshold plant, what grows inside, protected by what is planted at the edge. That practice is old, older than the medieval period, that provides our clearest records of it. The instinct to mark a boundary with something sacred, to define the protected space by what you place at its limits, is as old as the idea of a boundary itself. And vervain, which had marked the boundaries of temples and groves and sacred spaces for millennia, translated easily into the marking of the garden's edge. The same plant doing the same work in a smaller space for a more immediate need, feeding a family through winter rather than honoring a god. But the gesture underneath it, this line matters, this boundary is real. I am marking it with something that carries weight, is identical. What I find most remarkable about this entire strand of Vervain's history is not any single claim within it. It is the consistency of the underlying structure. Every use, however different its surface appearance, rests on the same foundation. Vervain operates at the places between things. It marks and protects thresholds. It moves between the ordinary and the extraordinary. It carries power in both directions. That structure has never changed. Not through Egypt and Greece and Rome. Not through the Druids and the Saxon leechdoms and the Welsh physicians. Not through the herb of the cross and the Sussex witch's charm and the vampire. Repelling tea, the same plant, the same essential understanding of what it is and what it does, dressed differently in each century, but recognizably, persistently itself. The tradition did not end with the 19th century. It did not fade with the arrival of modern medicine, or the decline of the old folk practices, or the general tendency of the age to reclassify what previous centuries had called sacred as merely superstitious. Vervain is still being gathered with intention, still being used in ceremony, still appearing on altars and in ritual washes, and in the preparations of people who take seriously the older understanding of what this plant carries. That continuity is worth acknowledging before we move into Vervain's medical history, because the two streams have never fully separated. They run parallel, sometimes braided together, from the ancient world to the present day. The modern uses are recognizably descended from what we have been tracing all evening. The ritual wash Vervain prepared and used to cleanse a person, a set of tools, a room before magical work, is the lustral water of the Druids in contemporary form, the same instinct, the same plant, the preparation of a threshold space before something important happens within it. On Wiccan and pagan altars, Vervain is placed specifically for its harmonizing quality, to bring peace to the space, to settle what needs settling before the rite begins. This is the altar preparation function that ran through every classical tradition we have examined. The first act, the making ready, modern Druidic practice still uses it as an anointing oil, for inspiration, for what the Welsh tradition called Ewen, the flowing, the creative current, the opening of the channels through which something larger than the ordinary self might move. Bards were anointed with it in the old tradition. That practice continues in lineages that have maintained an unbroken thread back to those older forms. The grimoire tradition fed into what contemporary practitioners call the enchanter's plant. The framing is consistent across centuries of occult writing. Vervain for purification, for protection, for magical empowerment, for the amplification of whatever work is being undertaken. A plant that does not substitute for the practitioner's intention, but sharpens and focuses it, clears the noise, prepares the ground. There is also the prosperity use, burning dried vervain as incense, on charcoal as a traditional working for wealth and the drawing of abundance to a household. This is not a use we have encountered in the classical or medieval sources in quite this form, though the broader association with the Verbinalia and Venus and the blessings that attend rite relationship with the sacred all point in the same direction. The domestic practical application of the plant's accumulated protective and magnetic qualities turned toward material well-being. Some contemporary herbal occult suppliers market vervain oils and baths in terms that would not have surprised the medieval synthesis. Dual purpose, ritual cleansing and mild relaxing support before meditation or spell work. The spiritual and the somatic acknowledged in the same sentence, the same overlap that the Anglo-Saxon leechdom practiced, that the mid-Fey physicians navigated, that every tradition working seriously with this plant has eventually arrived at, because the plant does not observe the boundary we have drawn between those categories. It acts on the body, it acts on the mind, it acts on whatever we mean when we gesture toward the spirit, all at once, without distinguishing between them. The people who have worked with it longest have always known this, and the people working with it now, in whatever framework they bring to the work, are discovering the same thing the Druids discovered, that the Romans discovered, that the woman sewing the silk bag by firelight discovered. The plant rewards attention. It rewards the willingness to approach it with intention, rather than simply extracting what you need and moving on. We are standing in a field in the dark, gathering it by starlight, because that tradition of respectful approach is older than almost any other tradition associated with this plant. And because some instructions accumulated across enough centuries by enough careful observers deserve to be followed even when you cannot fully explain them. Perhaps, especially then, the name itself may carry the connection. There is a folk etymology circulated across several European traditions that links Vervain's name directly to Venus, the goddess of love and desire and the complicated human experience of wanting another person. Whether that etymology is linguistically sound is a question for scholars of Latin. What it tells us is that the association between this plant and Venus ran deep enough that people sought to find it in the word itself, wanted the connection to be there from the beginning. Written into the name, we have already met the Verbinalia, the Roman festival that honored Venus and the herb together, but that festival deserves a second look now from this angle rather than the religious one. Roman festivals in honor of Venus were not solemn occasions. They were celebrations of what Venus represented. Desire, beauty, the pull between people, the particular happiness that another person can provide, and that no other source quite substitutes for. The Verbinalia placed vervain at the center of that celebration, not incidentally, not as decoration, but as the plant that embodied what the festival was for. That is a significant role for a plant that also cleansed Jupiter's altar. The range of it, from the highest formal sacred to the most intimate human experience, from the cosmic order upheld by the king of the gods to the private longing of a person who wants to be loved. Both, apparently, were within this plant's remit. The Hippocratic tradition adds another dimension, that careful, systematic Greek medical practice that gave Western medicine many of its foundational ideas included vervain in preparations for female infertility, a decoction, something prepared and administered with the specific intention of supporting reproductive potency. This is not love magic in the folk sense, this is clinical medicine. But the clinical medicine and the folk magic point at the same underlying understanding. Vervain has a relationship with fertility, with the generative capacity of the body, with the conditions that make new life possible. The Hippocratic physicians arrived at that understanding through observation and practice. The folk tradition arrived at it through the same route and expressed it in different language. The love charm and the medical decoction are two faces of the same recognition. At weddings, Vervain appeared in the bride's hair, in her bouquet, woven into the wreath she wore, or held in the flowers she carried to the altar. Two purposes, both practical in their way. First, to ensure what the couple were hoping for. A passionate beginning, lasting affection. The love that does not exhaust itself in the first season, but deepens and continues. Second, and perhaps equally important, in a world where the evil eye was a genuine concern and envy a real force to be managed. Protection. A wedding gathers attention. It draws eyes to the couple at the moment of their greatest happiness and vulnerability. The bundle of vervain in the bouquet was not merely ornamental, it was a ward, it said clearly, to whatever forces of envy or ill will might be present in the crowd of well-wishers. Not here, not today. This pair is protected. The threshold plant, again, at the most significant threshold a person crosses. The moment before and the moment after marriage being entirely different states of life, and vervain marking and protecting the crossing between them. The folk love magic was more direct, more specific in its instructions. A preparation of fresh vervain juice applied to the left hand, then a cross traced first on one's own forehead, then on the forehead of the desired person, a gesture that sealed the attraction, made it visible somehow, in the subtle register that such things were understood to operate in. The left hand is deliberate in the folk magical tradition. The left side is the receiving side, the side open to the invisible world, the side through which subtle forces move most readily. Fresh vervain juice on the left hand, and then that tracing gesture. The plant's accumulated power as conductor, the intention of the person performing it as the directing force. Many of these love rites acquired the same Christianized overlay we saw in the harvest charms, spoken words invoking saintly names alongside the older plant magic. The syncretic formula, ancient intention dressed in the available sacred language. A practitioner in a Christian community who still understood the older uses could work within both frameworks simultaneously, could invoke the saints and still trust the vervain. The Romani tradition carried vervain across borders and across the boundaries between communities, used as a love talisman, as a charm for good luck, carried on the person or incorporated into amulets. The Romani people had their own relationship with the older plant knowledge, absorbed and developed across centuries of movement through Europe, and vervain earned its place in that tradition on its own merits. Not through the classical history, which may or may not have been part of the specific knowledge carried, but through direct observation and experience and the kind of practical wisdom that accumulates when a plant proves itself repeatedly useful. Italy kept another strand of the tradition, the Cimaruta, a silver amulet, specifically associated with Neapolitan folk magic, cast in the shape of a sprig of rue with symbolic objects hanging from its branches. Among those objects, vervain flowers, in their Italian folk magical context, associated with the goddess Diana, another lunar liminal deity, another goddess of the threshold of the wild edges of the night. The plant found its way back, as it always does, to the same qualities. Even in the specific iconography of a protective amulet against the evil eye, vervain arrived carrying its familiar associations, the boundary, the protection, the sacred. What runs through all of this, from the Verbenalia to the wedding bouquet to the Romani talisman to the Neapolitan silver charm, is the understanding that love and protection are not separate concerns. That the same plant which protects can also draw, that the capacity to mark and strengthen a boundary also enables the reaching across that boundary toward another person. The threshold plant, once more, not an obstacle but a meeting place, not a wall but a door. The finest love magic has always understood this. You do not compel, you create the conditions for connection, you clear the space of what hinders it, you mark the moment of crossing as significant, worthy of ceremony and attention, and the best herb in your keeping. Vervain at the wedding, the oldest protective plant you could put in a bride's hands. Every civilization that used it seemed to understand why. We have been speaking all evening of the sacred, of altars and groves and the threshold between the ordinary world and whatever lies beyond it. But I want to turn now to something equally important, and in the long run, perhaps more practically significant. What did Vervain actually do for the people who used it? Not in the ceremonial sense. In the body, in the daily experience of illness and pain and the slow work of recovery, because the sacred reputation and the medical reputation of this plant developed together, and neither one fully explains the other, but both are necessary to understand what Vervain actually was to the people who relied on it. Dioscorides is the place to begin. He is always the place to begin with European herbal medicine. The first century physician whose De Materia Medica became the foundational text of Western plant medicine for 15 centuries. Everything that came after him worked either through him or in argument with him, and he addressed Vervain with the same careful attention he gave to every plant he considered worth documenting. He called it, as we have noted, a sacred herb, but his interest was not limited to its sacred status. He was a physician. He wanted to know what it did. Womb pains. That was the first medical application he recorded, specifically a pessary prepared with vervain and rose oil, a preparation designed to be used directly to address pain in the womb at its source. The combination with rose oil is interesting. Rose is a cooling, soothing material with its own long history of use for inflammation and heat. The pairing suggests Dioscorides understood this as a condition of excess heat of agitation that needed cooling and calming, rather than stimulating. He also prescribed it for headaches for mild diuretic effect, the encouragement of the body to release excess fluid, and he noted its promotion of tranquility. That word is worth dwelling on. Not sleep, exactly. Not sedation. Tranquility. The quieting of what has become too loud. The settling of what has been disturbed. These three things together, pain relief, fluid balance, tranquility, paint a picture of a plant working on the nervous system and the body's fluid processes simultaneously. A plant that addresses the agitation and the accumulation together. That is a coherent pharmacological profile, even described in first century terms. Hippocrates, or at least the tradition that grew up around his name, recommended vervain for fever and plague. Within the humoral framework, this was understood as cooling work. Fever is excess heat. A cooling remedy reduces that excess, brings the body back toward balance. The Hippocratic tradition was systematic about this. You identified the imbalance, you applied the remedy of the opposing quality, you returned the body to its proper proportion. Vervain as a cooling bitter fitted that framework precisely. Its pronounced bitterness, which we noted when we first handled it this evening, was understood to act on the liver and on the digestive processes in ways that reduced the kind of accumulation that led to fever. Not a dramatic intervention, a gradual correction, the slow patient work of a plant that does not announce itself. Pliny went further than either of them, as Pliny tended to. He documented the medical gathering rites in detail. Not simply when to harvest, but how the stem was to be cut at specific joints for specific conditions. Tertian fever, the kind that returned every third day, required the herb cut at a particular point. Quartan fever, returning every fourth day, required a different cut. The precision is striking. An entire protocol of harvesting technique mapped onto specific medical conditions. Whether the precise joint of cutting actually changed what the plant contained, I cannot say with certainty. What I can say is that the protocol ensured the plant was handled with attention, that the harvester arrived with a specific intention already formed, that the act of cutting was itself a focused, deliberate act rather than a casual one. Whatever the direct pharmacological effect, the practitioner who followed that protocol was also cultivating a quality of attention that serious medical work requires. The medieval inheritors of this classical tradition extended the list of conditions: stone, gout, dropsy, epilepsy, ulcers, specific fevers, still governed by the Plinian protocol of cutting at the third or fourth joint. This is a broad remit, perhaps too broad. Lists that long often indicate that a plant has acquired a reputation large enough to attract every condition that needed a treatment, whether or not the evidence for each was equally strong, but several of those conditions share an underlying feature: accumulation. Stone is accumulation in the kidneys or bladder. Gout is the accumulation of uric acid in the joints. Dropsy is the abnormal accumulation of fluid. A plant with genuine diuretic properties, genuinely supporting the body's ability to process and release excess, would address all of these at the same underlying level, whatever their superficially different presentations. That coherence, visible to us now with the benefit of pharmacological knowledge the medieval physician lacked, gives me confidence that the list was not entirely wishful thinking. The plant was doing something real. The tradition was observing real effects and attributing them, in the language available, to this plant. The classical knowledge did not stay in the classical world. We touched on this when we traced the dandelion's journey through the great Islamic medical centers of the 10th and 11th centuries. The same roots that carried the plant's reputation eastward carried Vervain along with it. Avicenna is the name that matters here. Ibn Sina, the Persian physician whose canon of medicine became, alongside Dioscorides, the foundational text of medieval medicine across both the Islamic world and eventually Western Europe, a work of extraordinary systematic ambition, the attempt to bring all of human medical knowledge into a single coherent framework. Vervain appears in it as a nerve tonic. That designation is worth pausing on, not a fever remedy or a wound treatment or a diuretic, though those uses were known. A nerve tonic, something that supports and strengthens the nervous system, the channels through which sensation and movement and the body's communication with itself travel. Avicenna was working within his own theoretical framework, distinct from the Greek humoral model, though deeply informed by it. His description of Vervain as a nerve tonic reflects what practitioners using the plant had observed, that it had a settling, strengthening effect on the system that governs the body's responses to the world, that it reduced something of the body's tendency toward agitation and excess reactivity. From Persia, the knowledge moved further. Trade routes carried not just goods but ideas, observations, the accumulated wisdom of one medical tradition into contact with another. Vervain eventually reached the later Indo-colonial Ayurvedic compendia, categorized there as a nervine and cooling bitter. Different theoretical frameworks, same two qualities identified. The calming effect on the nervous system, the cooling bitter action on the liver and digestion. Three medical traditions, Greek, Persian, Ayurvedic, arriving independently or through the chain of transmission at the same two observations about the same plant. The nerve calming quality, the cooling bitter action. We have seen this pattern before. With the dandelion across Chinese medicine and Arabian scholarship and Egyptian practice, when different traditions arrive at the same observations about a plant through independent routes, it is the strongest possible evidence that the plant is doing something real, something consistent enough to be noticed and named regardless of the theoretical language available for the naming. Vervain passed through all of these frameworks without being reduced to any one of them. Each tradition took what it needed and described what it observed, and the descriptions, beneath their different vocabularies, kept pointing at the same plant, with the same qualities, doing the same reliable work. The monasteries were the libraries of the medieval world, not only of books, though they preserved those too, but of practical knowledge, of the accumulated understanding of how to tend a sick body, how to prepare a remedy, how to grow and harvest and store the plants that made medicine possible. Every substantial monastery had its physic garden. We noted this when we traced the dandelion through the same institutions. That deliberate, tended space set aside specifically for the cultivation of healing plants. And Vervain was there, not as an intruder, not growing in a neglected corner. but cultivated with intention as an officinal herb. That word officinal is worth a moment. It derives from officina, the workshop or storeroom where the monastery's practical work was done. An officinal herb was not merely useful in a general sense, it was official. It belonged on the list, it was stocked, prepared, dispensed. When someone came to the monastery sick and in need, the monk who tended them reached for the officinal herbs without hesitation. They were the reliable ones, the ones the tradition had approved, and the practice had confirmed. Vervain earned that designation through both its sacred history and its consistent medical performance. The herb of the cross, sitting in a monastic garden, carried a theological endorsement that no other plant could quite match. And it also worked for wounds, for infections, for what the monastic herbals called simpler's joy, that phrase meaning the straightforward, dependable pleasure of a plant that does what it is supposed to do without complication or uncertainty. The simpler was the herbalist, who worked with single herbs rather than complex compounds. Simpler's joy was the plant that rewarded that worked reliably. Vervain as a wound herb, an infection herb, a straightforward tool in the hands of someone who knew how to use it. The sacred and the practical held together as they always were in the monastic tradition, without tension. By the 16th century, the apothecaries had formalized this considerably. Vervain became the official herb of the English apothecary trade for a remarkable range of applications. 30 ailments, by some accounts. That number reflects the breadth of accumulated traditional use rather than a single systematic study. But 30 conditions across different body systems being addressed by the same plant speaks to real versatility. The Elizabethan apothecaries' specific areas tell us something about what practitioners had observed. Digestive complaints, lung conditions, sexual health, preventive use. These four categories span the body from the gut to the chest to the reproductive system, to the general maintenance of health in a person not yet ill but wishing to remain. So a plant useful across that range is a plant that operates at a fairly fundamental level, not targeting one specific tissue or one specific pathology, but influencing underlying processes that affect multiple systems. Vervain wine deserves particular attention. Apothecaries prepared and prescribed it against epidemics. The bitter compounds in Vervain were understood as preservatives, as substances that resisted the kind of corruption and putrefaction that was associated with epidemic illness. Whether or not that understanding maps precisely onto modern microbiology, bitter plant compounds do have demonstrable antimicrobial properties. The apothecary prescribing Vervain wine against plague was working with something real, even if the theoretical explanation was imprecise. And wine as a medium is significant. Alcohol extracts different compounds from a plant than water does. A Vervain wine would have carried constituents that a simple tea might not, and done so in a preserved, stable form that could be stored and dispensed over time. The choice of preparation method shows a level of practical sophistication about what the plant contained and how to best extract it. Then there is Hildegard. Hildegard of Bingen is one of the most remarkable figures in the entire history of European medicine. A 12th century Benedictine abbess who wrote, among an extraordinary range of other works, 2 substantial texts on natural medicine, Physica and Causae et Curae. A woman working within the monastic tradition, but bringing to it a quality of systematic observation and a willingness to develop her own theoretical positions that set her apart from most of her contemporaries. She addressed Vervain with characteristic precision. Her framework was humoral, as all medieval medicine was, but her application of it was specific and practical rather than merely theoretical. Vervain she classified as cooling, not simply bitter, not simply purifying, but specifically cooling in its action on the body, and she mapped that cooling quality onto a precise set of conditions where excess heat was the underlying problem. Throat swelling, the inflammation that closes the throat, that makes swallowing painful, that signals the body in a state of local heat and accumulation. Vervain as a poultice applied to the outside of the throat, the cooling quality acting on the inflamed tissue from without reducing what had become excessive. Ulcers, wounds that have turned hot, that have become infected, that have moved from simple injury into the more dangerous territory of festering. Again, a cooling application to tissue that has become too hot in Hildegard's understanding, too agitated, too reactive. Jaundice, a condition the medieval physician recognized as involving the liver, as yellow discoloration, and the specific quality of illness that accompanies liver dysfunction. Vervain's action on the liver, which we trace back through Dioscorides and the Egyptian physicians and the Greek tradition, appearing here in Hildegard's specific clinical application, the cooling bitter addressing the heat and congestion in that organ. Gum infections. Tooth and gum disease in the medieval world was a source of considerable suffering and, at its worst, real danger. Hildegard's use of vervain for gum infections is a topical antiseptic application. The plant's antimicrobial properties directed at a specific site of infection, practical, targeted, consistent with what we now understand vervain to contain. What strikes me about Hildegard's list is how well it holds together. These are not randomly accumulated conditions attached to a plant with a large reputation. They share an underlying logic: excess heat, local inflammation, the need for cooling and resolving what has accumulated. A single theoretical principle applied consistently across different body systems: throat, skin, liver, gum, the same action, the same plant, the same approach adjusted to different locations. That kind of coherent application is the mark of a practitioner who has actually worked with a plant rather than simply inheriting a list of its reputed uses and copying them forward. Hildegard understood vervain. She understood what it did and why, within her framework, it did it. And she used that understanding to apply it precisely rather than broadly. The poultice was her preferred form for the topical applications. Vervain prepared and applied directly to the site of the problem. Fresh plant material or reconstituted dried herb, placed against the swollen throat, the infected gum, the ulcerated skin, contact between the plant and the tissue that needed its action. This is the oldest form of herbal medicine, more ancient than decoctions and tinctures, and the elaborate preparations of the later apothecary tradition, the direct application of plant to wound. And Hildegard, working at the height of medieval medical sophistication, still found it the right choice for these particular conditions, still trusted the directness of it, the plant, the tissue, the cooling action working at the point of need. She sits in a long line of careful observers, Dioscorides, before her. Avicenna in parallel, the midwife physicians in Wales working within their own tradition at roughly the same period, all of them looking at this same plant in their different contexts and finding in it something consistent and reliable and worth the attention of a serious practitioner. The field is quiet around us. The stems in these bundles are beginning to feel like something more than botanical specimens. They carry all of this, every hand that has prepared and applied and studied and recorded, every careful observation written down in Latin or Welsh or Persian. A poultice for a swollen throat, simple enough, old enough to be beyond counting. Nicholas Culpeper is a figure I have considerable respect for, not uncritical respect. He was a man of strong opinions, and he expressed them freely, which is both his great virtue and occasionally his limitation. But he was also a man who believed that medical knowledge should belong to ordinary people, who translated and published and made accessible what had been kept in Latin and in the hands of those who could afford physicians. His English Physician, published in 1652, put the herbal tradition into the hands of anyone who could read. And a great many people who could read used it. It went through edition after edition. It shaped the practical herbal knowledge of ordinary English households for generations. He addressed vervain with the attention it deserved. His particular emphasis was on what he called women's complaints, a broad category in the medicine of his time, covering the full range of conditions specific to the female body, uterine problems, painful menstruation, irregular cycles, and significantly menopausal symptoms, palpitations, hot flushes, The disturbed sleep that accompanies that particular passage in a woman's life. That last group is notable. Menopausal palpitations and disturbed sleep are not conditions that appear prominently in the earlier classical sources. Dioscorides addressed womb pain. The Hippocratic tradition noted the reproductive applications, but Culpeper's specific attention to the menopausal transition and his recommendation of Vervain for it reflects an accumulated observation from centuries of practice. Practitioners working with women through that transition had noticed what helped, and Vervain was among the things that helped. The cooling quality that Hildegard had identified, the nerve-calming action that Avicenna had recorded as a tonic, the tranquility that Dioscorides had noted, all of these applied to the specific constellation of symptoms that accompany the menopausal transition add up to something coherent. A plant that reduces heat, calms the nervous system, promotes settled sleep, the same profile, applied now to a specific life stage. Culpeper also prescribed it for gout, for yellow jaundice, for shortness of breath, for dropsy. He was explicit about the hepatic and diuretic mechanisms he understood to be at work. The liver supported, the kidneys encouraged. The accumulations that produced gout and dropsy and jaundice addressed at their underlying level rather than symptom by symptom. These are consistent with everything we have seen from Hildegard backward through the medieval tradition to Dioscorides and the Hippocratic writers. The same plant, the same applications, refined and developed across 15 centuries of careful use. Culpeper brought it into the vernacular, made it accessible to the woman preparing her own household remedies, and the man who could not afford a physician's fee. He trusted the tradition and he trusted the plant. That trust carried forward through his enormously widely read work, ensured that Vervain remained in common use through the 17th century and beyond. In cottage gardens and kitchen windowsills and the stock of every apothecary who took the English tradition seriously. Now I want to ask you to do something the field makes easier than shop would. Look up. The same stars are visible from every point on this earth. The same Sirius that guided the Druidic harvest rises over China and Ethiopia and the territories of the Iroquois and the Shawnee. The same sky connects traditions that never spoke to one another, never exchanged a letter or a trading cargo, never had any way to compare their observations. And yet the same plant appears in all of them, doing recognizably similar work, being understood in terms that, beneath their different vocabularies, point at the same properties. This is the most powerful argument for a plant's genuine usefulness. Not the classical pedigree, not the famous names who recommended it, but the independent convergence of distant traditions working without knowledge of each other, arriving at the same conclusions. Traditional Chinese medicine employed Vervain against malaria, against infectious febrile conditions. Malaria is characterized above all by fever, by the cycles of heat that the body generates in its effort to fight the parasite. A plant with genuine antipyretic properties, with the capacity to reduce fever and antimicrobial action, would be exactly what a careful practitioner would reach for. The Chinese medical tradition was nothing if not careful. Centuries of systematic observation, documented and passed forward with extraordinary fidelity. Their use of Vervain for malaria fevers is consistent with the cooling antipyretic profile we have been tracing through the Greek and Islamic and medieval European traditions. Different continent, different disease, same underlying plant action recognized. The broader Chinese and Ayurvedic use extended to fever of various kinds, to rheumatism, to digestive complaints, to what both traditions described in terms of energy balance. The Western equivalent would be the tonic function that Avicenna had noted, a plant that restores proper function to systems that have become dysregulated, that brings the body back toward its proper rhythm. Rheumatism is worth noting specifically. Painful, inflamed joints, the accumulation of what both Greek and Chinese medicine understood as excess in the joint tissues. A plant with anti-inflammatory and diuretic properties addressing that accumulation, reducing the heat and swelling, supporting the body's ability to clear what should not be there. We see it in Culpeper's gout applications. We see it here in the Chinese and Ayurvedic rheumatism treatments. The same action, named differently, recognized independently. Moved to Ethiopia, a continent and a tradition entirely outside the European and Asian medical lineages we have been following. Ethiopian healers used vervain leaves for ear infections, roots for tonsillitis. The distinction between leaf and root for different complaints reflects a sophisticated botanical knowledge. Different parts of the same plant contain different proportions of its active constituents. A tradition that has worked with a plant long enough will develop specific knowledge about which part does which work. Ear infections and tonsillitis are both infections of the head and throat. Both involve inflammation, heat, the accumulation of what should not be there. The Ethiopian applications are consistent with Hildegard's throat applications, with the Anglo-Saxon use against infections, with the antimicrobial properties that modern analysis has confirmed. But the Ethiopian tradition arrived at this independently, through its own observation, its own accumulation of experience. Now across to North America, the Shawnee people steeped mashed vervain leaves for a preparation used to induce visions. For what I might cautiously describe as pragmatic, altered states, the deliberate use of the plant's effects on the nervous system for purposes that went beyond the purely physical. This is the prophetic, the perceptual opening use we encountered in the Gaulish tradition. Two traditions, separated by an ocean and millennia of independent development, reaching for the same plant, for the same quality of purpose. The nervous system effect that Avicenna called tonic, that Culpeper addressed through menopausal palpitations and disturbed sleep, that the Gaulish Druids used for prophecy, the Shawnee were working with the same underlying action, the settling, opening, quieting of the ordinary noise that allows something else to become audible. The Iroquois used it differently. Cold vervain water applied to infections and to what their tradition called woundworms, parasitic infestation of wounds. A cold antimicrobial preparation applied directly to infected tissue. The same direct application that Hildegard favored with her poultices. The same antimicrobial logic that the Ethiopian healers applied to ears and tonsils. Different people, different continents, different centuries, same plant, same basic application. There is a quality to these convergences that I find genuinely moving. Each of these traditions developed its knowledge through the same method. Attention, trial, the careful noting of what worked and what did not, the passing forward of that knowledge to the next generation. In Iroquois longhouses and Ethiopian villages and Shawnee communities and Chinese medical academies and the monasteries of medieval Europe, people were doing the same work, paying attention to the same plant, writing down or memorizing or passing through apprenticeship what they had learned. None of them knew about the others. All of them were right about the same things. Austria adds a quieter note to this global chorus. Traditional Austrian medicine prepared vervain as a tea or a liquor specifically for infections and fever. The liquor form is interesting. Alcohol extraction again, as with the apothecary wine, drawing out constituents that water alone would not carry. Preserved for storage, available through winter when fresh herbs were not to be had. A practical tradition maintaining a practical plant in a practical form suited to the climate and the conditions of the people using it. Tea or liquor, root or leaf, poultice or decoction or wine or infused oil, cold water wash or warm steam. Every tradition found its own form for the same plant, suited to its own conditions, its own available materials, its own specific needs. And through all of that variation in form, the same consistent actions, anti-inflammatory, antimicrobial, antipyretic, nervine, diuretic, hepatic support. These words are modern. The traditions that observed these actions had their own words for them, cooling, tonic, resolving, clarifying, strengthening, but they were describing the same things. The plant was not performing differently for different peoples. It was the same plant, doing the same things being observed by careful eyes in every corner of the world that knew it. Which brings me back to what we are doing here tonight. Standing in a field that joins us, whether we think of it that way or not, to every one of those traditions, every hand that gathered this plant at the right hour, every careful practitioner who noted what it did and passed that knowledge forward. We are not separate from that history. We are the most recent point in it. The stems in your hands right now have been gathered this way, with this intention, in this quality of darkness, for longer than any civilization currently standing has been in existence. That is not a small thing to hold. There is a particular kind of patient that every practitioner who works long enough will come to know very well. They are not acutely ill. The crisis has passed. The fever broke a week ago, or the influenza ran its course, or the difficult season finally ended. By the visible measures, they have recovered, they are up and about, they are eating, they are managing their days. And yet they are not right. There is a flatness that was not there before, a tiredness that sleep does not entirely resolve, a fragility in the nervous system, a tendency toward anxiety or low mood, or a quality of being more easily overwhelmed than they were before the illness. The body has healed. Something else has not quite followed. This is the state that the Western herbal tradition called nervous exhaustion, post-illness melancholia, the depleted condition that follows prolonged stress or sustained illness and leaves a person technically recovered, but functionally diminished. Vervain was the herb for this state, above most others. The reasoning in the tradition is careful and coherent. The nervous system, having been under sustained demand during illness or stress, has used more than it has taken in. It is running at a deficit. What it needs is not stimulation, and not simply sedation, but something that nourishes and restores the underlying capacity, that tones the system, returns it to proper function from below, rather than overriding its symptoms from above. This is the distinction between a nervine tonic and a simple sedative. A sedative quiets the noise. A nervine tonic addresses why the noise is there. Vervain, in the Western herbal classification, is the former. Not a drug that overrides the nervous system's dysregulation, but a tonic that gradually corrects it. The mechanism the tradition identified was elegant. Vervain supports the liver. Better liver function means better detoxification, better processing of what the body has accumulated during illness, better clearance of the metabolic residue of sustained stress. Improved liver function supports better nutrient absorption. Better nutrient absorption means the nervous system begins to receive what it needs to restore itself. The tonic action on the nervous system and the hepatic action on the liver are not separate effects. They are one continuous process, the plant working on the system as a whole. This is why Vervain in convalescence was recommended as a sustained course rather than a single dose. You were not treating a symptom, you were rebuilding a capacity. That takes time, weeks rather than days. The bitter compounds working their slow, patient action on the liver and digestion, while the nervine compounds steadied and gradually strengthened the system that had been overtaxed. The specific emotional picture that the tradition associated with the nervous exhaustion state is worth describing. Irritability, a kind of driven quality, a tendency to push too hard, to demand too much of oneself even in weakness. Perfectionism that has curdled under stress into anxiety. The person who cannot fully rest because something in them will not permit it, who lies awake with thoughts that will not settle, whose digestion is affected by the same tension that affects their sleep and their mood. This is the irritated, depressed state the tradition described. Not depression in the sense of emptiness and withdrawal, a tighter, more driven, more exhausted version of it. The person who has given too much for too long and whose body and nervous system are making the cost of that visible. Vervain for this person, specifically and consistently across the tradition. The cooling bitter for the liver, the nervine tonic for the depleted system, the antispasmodic for the tension that has lodged itself in the body's tissues and will not let go. That word antispasmodic is one of the technical descriptions Western herbalism applies to Vervain, alongside bitter, nervine tonic, parasympathomenic, meaning it supports the action of the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest mode, the physiological state of safety and restoration that stress and illness suppress. Analgesic in a mild sense, emmenagogue, meaning it supports and regulates menstruation, consistent with the applications Dioscorides and Culpeper, both documented. That list of technical actions is the modern herbalist way of saying what Avicenna said when he called it a nerve tonic. What Hildegard was describing when she applied it to the hot, inflamed, agitated conditions. What Culpeper observed in the menopausal woman whose palpitations and disturbed sleep reflected a nervous system under a specific kind of sustained demand. The same plant, the same actions, described with increasing technical precision as the language for describing them improved, but pointing at the same things across all of those centuries of careful observation. The broader Western folk tradition was somewhat less systematic, but equally consistent in its reach. Nervous conditions of various kinds, depression, anxiety, insomnia, cuts, burns, and wounds needing the antimicrobial and healing support, inflammatory swellings, poisonous bites, which takes us back to the Saxon lechdom tradition and forward to the recognized anti-inflammatory action. Mouth and throat ulcers, which places us directly in Hildegard's territory. Swollen glands. Near panacea is the phrase the tradition uses for this range of applications. I am cautious about that word. A true panacea, a cure for all things, does not exist, and the claim should make any careful practitioner suspicious. But near panacea in a more limited sense, a plant that addresses conditions across multiple body systems through a coherent underlying mechanism. That is a different and defensible claim. Vervain's coherent mechanism is the combination of hepatic bitter, anti-inflammatory nervine tonic, and antispasmodic actions working together on the system as a whole. A person whose liver is working well, whose nervous system is nourished and properly regulated, whose inflammatory responses are appropriately modulated, whose spasms and tensions are eased, that person will be better placed to handle a wide range of complaints. Not because Vervain cured each of those complaints separately, but because it improved the underlying conditions from which many of them arose. That is what a good tonic plant does, and Vervain is, at its core, a tonic plant. The most ancient traditions knew this, the Hippocratic physician who recommended it for general restoration, the Roman who described it as herba sacra, not only in the sacred sense, but in the sense of being set apart for its exceptional usefulness. Theophrastus who called it a tonic, in that careful, specific Greek sense, not for crisis, for the slow, quiet work of keeping the body in order. It also works for anxiety and mild depression, specifically where there is digestive or hepatic involvement. This is a useful clinical refinement. Not all anxiety is the same, not all low mood has the same origin. Vervain is particularly suited to the kind where the gut and liver are part of the picture, where the mood disturbance and the digestive disturbance are both expressions of the same underlying imbalance, where addressing the liver and the digestion also addresses the mood, because the gut and the liver influence the mind in ways we are only now beginning to map precisely with modern tools. The tradition knew this empirically, observed it in patient after patient, generation after generation, did not have the vocabulary of the gut-brain axis or hepatic metabolism of neurotransmitter precursors, but knew from watching people recover under Vervain's influence that these things were connected. The cold air is settling now. We are past the midpoint of the night. This is when the hands begin to feel the work and the mind begins to move differently. A little quieter, a little more open to what is here rather than what is elsewhere. It is the right state for what we have been gathering. Vervain, the plant that rewards attention and quietness, that works best in a system that has let go of its urgency, that belongs, as it has always belonged, to this hour rather than the busy ones. Hold the bundle a moment and breathe in. Even dried, even cut and gathered, something persists. A faint bitterness in the air, the slight astringency that tells you something active is present, waiting to do its work. 40 years, and I am still grateful for that smell, still reminded by it of what a serious plant this is. We have spoken of the liver many times this evening. In almost every tradition we have passed through, the liver appeared. The Egyptian physicians noted it. The Greek tradition addressed it. The Arabian scholars built specific applications around it. Hildegard's cooling poultices were working at its level indirectly. Culpeper prescribed for it directly. The Chinese and Ayurvedic traditions both identified hepatic action as central to what Vervain does. There is a reason for that consistency, and it is worth spending time on the mechanism, because understanding what is actually happening in the body when Vervain is used makes every one of those historical applications more legible. Begin with bitterness. The taste you would notice immediately if you chewed a fresh leaf from one of these stems, pronounced unmistakable, slightly astringent alongside the bitterness, a quality that makes the mouth contract slightly, that signals the presence of tannins working on the mucous membranes. That bitterness is not incidental. It is the mechanism announcing itself through the oldest sensory channel available. The moment bitter receptors on the tongue are stimulated, a cascade begins. Saliva increases. The stomach begins to prepare gastric acid. The pancreas is primed to release its digestive enzymes, the gallbladder. That small muscular organ tucked beneath the liver begins to contract and release bile into the small intestine. All of this before a single compound from the plant has been absorbed into the bloodstream. The taste alone initiates the process. This is why the old herbalists insisted that bitter medicines be tasted rather than swallowed quickly or taken in capsules that bypass the tongue entirely. They did not know the neurological mechanism, but they knew from observation that the taste mattered, that taking the bitter without tasting it reduced its effect. They were right. The reflex begins in the mouth. What follows when the bitter compounds are absorbed supports and extends what the taste reflex began. Bile secretion increases further. Gallbladder contractility improves. Intestinal motility, the rhythmic muscular movement that carries food through the digestive tract, is enhanced. The whole digestive process is stimulated, coordinated, moved from sluggishness back toward its proper rhythm. This is what the tradition meant by liver stagnation, not a diseased liver in the acute sense. A liver that is working below its capacity, processing too slowly, producing bile insufficiently, not clearing what it should be clearing at the rate it should be clearing at. The consequence of that stagnation spreads outward. Digestion becomes sluggish. Nutrient absorption declines. The body accumulates what should have been cleared. The mood, as we have noted, often reflects the liver's condition. Vervain, as a hepatic choletic tonic, addresses this at its root. The choletic action specifically means the stimulation of bile production and flow. This is distinct from a cholagogue, which stimulates the gallbladder to contract and release bile already produced. Vervain does both, encourages production and encourages release. The whole biliary system moved back toward its proper function. The traditional use for stones is consistent with this. Kidney stones and bladder stones form when certain compounds accumulate in the urine at concentrations higher than the fluid, can keep in solution. They crystallize, they become painful, they obstruct. A plant that increases urine flow and supports the liver's processing of those compounds reduces the conditions that allow stones to form, the diuretic action and the hepatic action working together on the same underlying problem. The expulsion of stones already formed is a stronger claim, and I will not overstate it, but the prevention of their formation and the supportive use during the passage of small stones through increased fluid flow and reduced concentration of the relevant compounds. That is a coherent application well within what Vervain demonstrably does. Modern clinical herbalists have refined the hepatic use further. Vervain is now specifically employed for what they describe as liver congestion secondary to cardiovascular issues. The heart and the liver are connected in ways the ancient traditions intuited and the modern clinic has mapped more precisely. When the right side of the heart is working under strain, The venous return through the liver is compromised. The liver becomes congested. That congestion produces its downstream effects, and a cooling hepatic bitter that supports liver function and reduces congestion has a role in that picture. Alongside this, the same practitioners note concurrent benefits for tension-type headaches. For neck and shoulder muscle spasm, this is where the hepatic and the nervine actions converge in the clinical picture. A person carrying congestion in the liver will often also carry tension in the upper body. The two are connected through pathways that the tradition described in terms of energy, and the modern clinic describes in terms of nervous system tone and inflammatory load. Vervain, working on both simultaneously, addresses the headache and the shoulder tension, not by numbing them, but by resolving something upstream of them. This is the kind of clinical observation that accumulates over decades of careful practice. You cannot get it from a single trial. You get it from treating the same pattern of symptoms in patient after patient, noting what shifts when vervain is included, building a picture of how this plant functions in a real body, carrying real complexity. The compounds responsible for these effects have now been partially identified. Iridoids are among the primary active constituents, bitter glycosides of a specific class, that have been shown to stimulate digestive secretions and possess anti-inflammatory and hepatoprotective properties. Polyphenols that act as antioxidants, reducing the oxidative damage that accompanies liver congestion and chronic inflammation. Tannins contributing the astringent antimicrobial action. Modern laboratory studies have confirmed what the tradition observed. Vervain extracts show antioxidant effects in tested systems. Anti-inflammatory activity has been demonstrated in multiple models. Hepatoprotective effects, meaning the plant compounds actively reduce damage to liver cells under conditions of stress, have been confirmed in research settings. Ethnopharmacological surveys, the systematic study of traditional plant uses to identify candidates for modern pharmacological investigation, have specifically highlighted vervain as a traditional remedy for infectious hepatic diseases. Jaundice, chronic liver congestion, hepatic infections. The researchers working through traditional sources and noting which plants appear consistently across independent traditions for the same conditions are arriving by a very different route at the same plant for the same liver applications that the Egyptian physicians and the Arabian scholars and Hildegard and Culpeper all independently identified. This is what validation looks like when it finally comes. Not a dramatic announcement, just the slow convergence of modern methods onto the same conclusions that careful observers reached centuries and millennia before the methods existed. The tradition was not imagining it. The liver application was real, the diuretic action was real. The anti-inflammatory effect that made it useful for swollen glands and throat inflammation and poisonous bites and skin conditions was real. The nervine tonic quality that ran through every tradition from Avicenna forward was real. Real and consistent and demonstrable by the methods of modern pharmacology, as it was demonstrable by the methods of careful observation across 4,000 years of use. I think sometimes about what it means to hold a plant that carries that weight of confirmation, that has been tested by more practitioners in more conditions across more centuries than any clinical trial could encompass, tested not under controlled conditions with isolated compounds, but in the full complexity of real bodies carrying real illness and real hope, and found reliable. Consistently across all of that testing, found reliable. The stems in this bundle are the same plant as those gathered by the monk in the Physic garden and the Egyptian priest before the altar and the Saxon healer consulting the leechdom by firelight. The compounds in these leaves are the same compounds those practitioners were working with. We have better words for them now. We have mechanisms where they had observations, but the plant has not changed, and neither has what it does. There is a pattern in the way this plant works that becomes clearer the more applications you examine. Vervain does not act on one system in isolation. It acts on the quality of tension itself, on the body's tendency under stress or under particular physiological conditions to contract, to cramp, to hold, to resist the natural rhythms that keep things moving as they should. The antispasmodic action runs through almost every clinical application of this plant, from the digestive tract to the uterus to the muscles of the neck and shoulders, to the blood vessels of the head. This is why the menstrual applications have always been central to the tradition, not peripheral, not a secondary use alongside the liver work or the nervous system work central. Because the menstrual cycle, when it goes wrong in ways that are precisely the patterns Vervain addresses. Dioscorides noted womb pains in the 1st century. Culpeper addressed them with his characteristic directness in the 17th. The ethnopharmacological surveys of the modern period, working through traditional plant use across multiple cultures and regions, consistently find Vervain listed for menstrual cramps, for premenstrual tension, for the headaches that accompany menstruation in many women. That consistency across 20 centuries of documentation is a strong signal. The same application, recorded in the same terms by practitioners working in entirely different theoretical frameworks. What they shared was the patient in front of them and the plant in their dispensary. What they independently observed was that the plant. The mechanism is now reasonably well understood. Menstrual cramps arise primarily from uterine muscle contractions. Prostaglandins trigger those contractions. When prostaglandin levels are high, or the tissue is abnormally sensitive to their effects, the contractions become painful spasms rather than the productive rhythmic movement the uterus needs. An antispasmodic that also has anti-inflammatory properties that reduces both the spasm and the inflammatory mediators driving it, addresses the problem at 2 levels simultaneously. This is what Vervain offers: the antispasmodic action relaxing the uterine muscle, the anti-inflammatory compounds reducing the prostaglandin-driven component, the nervine tonic addressing the heightened sensitivity of a nervous system that has been under premenstrual hormonal stress, all 3 working together on what presents from the patient's perspective as a single experience of pain. The premenstrual tension, specifically, the irritability and anxiety and emotional rawness of the days before menstruation, sits within the same picture: the nervous system under hormonal demand, the liver working harder to process the hormonal changes, the digestive system often affected by the same tension that affects the uterus. Vervain, addressing the liver, the nervous system, and the spasm simultaneously, is a coherent choice for this pattern. The menstrual migraine is another expression of the same underlying problem. The headaches that strike in the days before or during menstruation are not identical in mechanism to all migraines, but they share the feature of being driven by vascular and hormonal changes that produce intense, often one-sided pain. A plant that is cooling, anti-inflammatory, antispasmodic, and that relieves the liver congestion that can contribute to vascular headaches, is addressing the conditions from which these headaches arise. Modern studies have confirmed antispasmodic and mild analgesic activity in Vervain extracts. The analgesic is mild. This is not a plant that numbs pain through suppression. It is a plant that reduces pain by reducing the conditions that produce it. A meaningful distinction, both therapeutically and philosophically. The tradition understood this as appropriate. You do not silence the body's signals. You address what is generating them. The emmenagogue action, the stimulation and regulation of menstruation, sits alongside the antispasmodic in the traditional description. A plant can be both, can reduce the pain of menstruation, while also supporting the regularity and completeness of the process. The uterus that is well supported, properly nourished, through good liver function and good nervous system tone, performs its monthly work more efficiently and less painfully. The antispasmodic and the emmenagogue are 2 faces of the same underlying support. The antispasmodic and anti-inflammatory actions that make Vervain useful for uterine cramps extend naturally to other muscular and inflammatory conditions throughout the body. The urinary tract is a system of smooth muscle tubes and chambers, subject to the same kinds of spasm and inflammation that affect the uterus. Cystitis, infection and inflammation of the bladder, produces a burning, cramping discomfort that the antispasmodic and anti-inflammatory actions of Vervain address directly. The diuretic action supports this further. Increased urine flow flushes the inflamed tract, keeps the concentration of irritants low, supports the body's own effort to clear the infection. For urinary stones, we have already noted the mechanism, the diuretic action increasing urine volume, the anti-inflammatory action reducing the irritation that small stones cause as they move, the astringent tannins toning the mucous membranes of the urinary tract. These three work together to make the passage of small stones more manageable and to reduce the conditions that allow them to form. Gout belongs to the same territory. Uric acid crystals depositing in joints, the same accumulation problem addressed by the same diuretic and anti-inflammatory combination. Culpeper prescribed it for gout. The medieval list included it. The mechanism running through all of those traditional applications is now clear. Increase clearance, reduce inflammation. Address the accumulation at its source rather than merely treating the pain it produces. Edema, what the older tradition called dropsy, is the abnormal accumulation of fluid in the tissues. The diuretic action is the primary tool here, supported by the hepatic action. A liver working better processes the proteins and other factors that regulate fluid balance, reduces the conditions that allow fluid to accumulate in the tissues. Lactation support appears in the traditional list. A nursing mother producing insufficient milk, the emmenagogue and hormonal regulating properties that make Vervain useful for the menstrual cycle, extending into the hormonal context of lactation. Prolactin, the hormone that drives milk production, is influenced by the same liver and nervous system balance that Vervain supports more broadly. The mechanism is indirect but coherent. Then the respiratory applications. These appear less prominently in the earlier classical sources, but become more consistent through the medieval and early modern periods and are documented in contemporary reviews. Cough, bronchitis, asthma, sinusitis. The common thread across these is inflammation of the respiratory mucous membranes and the spasm of respiratory smooth muscle. Coughs driven by bronchial irritation and spasm, the bronchial constriction of asthma, the inflamed, congested mucous membranes of sinusitis. The antispasmodic action on smooth muscle is not limited to the uterus or the urinary tract. Bronchial smooth muscle is subject to the same kind of spasm. An antispasmodic that reduces bronchial constriction is supporting easier breathing. The anti-inflammatory action, reducing the mucosal inflammation that drives both the cough and the congestion. The astringent tannins, toning the irritated membranes, reducing their tendency toward excessive mucus production. Taken as a tea, the steam itself offers something. The volatile compounds released in hot water, carrying the anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial action directly to the respiratory mucous membranes with each breath. This is the steam inhalation that Hildegard's tradition used for time, and that every herbalist working with respiratory herbs has employed. The same logic, the same directness of delivery. The plant's active constituents carried on water vapor to the precise site of need. As a gargle for throat conditions, Vervain prepares the inflamed tissue with the astringent tannins and the anti-inflammatory compounds at direct contact, the same topical logic as Hildegard's poultice, applied differently. The throat bathed in something cooling and antimicrobial and astringent. The tissue calmed, the inflammation reduced, the spasm eased. What emerges from reviewing all of these applications together is a picture of a plant that acts on smooth muscle, on inflammatory processes, on mucous membranes, and on the nervous system across the entire body. Not through a single targeted mechanism, but through a suite of related actions that address the underlying physiological states. Excess tension, excess inflammation, excess accumulation that produce a wide range of symptoms in different locations. This is what the Western tradition meant when it called Vervain near panacea. Not that it cures everything, that it addresses several fundamental patterns of dysfunction that manifest differently depending on which body system they occur in. The uterine cramp and the bronchial spasm and the cystitis and the tension headache are different expressions of related underlying states. A plant that addresses those states addresses all of their expressions. That is not magic, that is a plant with a coherent pharmacological profile, working across the systems where that profile is relevant, which turns out in a body under the kinds of stress and imbalance that human bodies commonly encounter to be quite a few systems indeed. The sky is beginning to change, not light yet, but the quality of the dark has shifted. The deepest part of the night is behind us. This is the hour the old instructions were pointing toward all along. Not the harvest hour, that was Sirius rising earlier, but the hour of sitting with what has been gathered, of letting the work settle into quiet. We have spent much of this evening moving through internal medicine. The liver, the nervous system, the uterus, the urinary tract, the lungs, the work Vervain does inside the body. But the oldest medicine is external. Before anyone prepared a decoction or measured a dose or considered a mechanism, people pressed plant material against wounds and watched what happened. This direct, immediate use of plant against damaged tissue is where herbal knowledge begins. And Vervain, as we have seen throughout the tradition, was consistently among the plants chosen for this work. The poultice is the fundamental form, bruised or mashed plant material, applied directly to the site of the problem, held in place by cloth or by the hand, changed when it dries or cools. The active compounds in direct contact with the tissue that needs them. No extraction required, no preparation beyond making the plant available to the skin. Bruises, the tissue damage beneath unbroken skin. The swelling and discoloration that follows impact, an anti-inflammatory applied topically reduces the local inflammation response, helps clear the accumulated blood from the damaged tissue, speeds the resolution of the bruise. Vervain poultice for bruising is documented across the tradition from the classical period forward. The mechanism is exactly what you would expect from a plant with demonstrated anti-inflammatory constituents. Hemorrhoids, inflamed, swollen venous tissue in sensitive location. The astringent tannins applied topically tone the distended tissue, reduce its inflammation, bring down the swelling. The same astringency that makes Vervain useful as a gargle for inflamed throat membranes applies directly here. The tissue tightened and calmed by contact with the plant's tannin compounds. Eczema, the chronic inflammatory skin condition, with its cycles of flare and remission. Anti-inflammatory and astringent applications providing symptomatic relief during flare. The topical anti-inflammatory reducing the local immune response, driving the inflammation. The astringent toning, the weeping, damaged skin barrier. Not a cure, a reliable source of relief that the tradition returned to because it worked well enough to be worth returning to. The mouth is where the external and internal uses blur most interestingly. A gargle is both topical and partially systemic. The plant material in contact with the mucous membranes of the mouth and throat for the duration of the gargle, then swallowed or spat, the compounds partially absorbed through the oral mucosa. During contact, for tonsillitis, the inflamed and often infected tonsillar tissue bathed directly in something antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory. Hildegard's throat applications reach forward here to modern clinical documentation. A trial on Vervain decoction for chronic gingivitis showed measurable benefit. The gum tissue, chronically inflamed, responding to the same astringent and anti-inflammatory action that the tradition had always applied to this tissue. Mouth ulcers and canker sores, painful breaks in the oral mucous membrane, the astringent tannins creating a temporary protective film over the ulcer surface. The anti-inflammatory compounds reducing the local inflammation that makes these lesions so painful. The antimicrobial action, reducing secondary infection in the broken tissue. Three mechanisms working together in a single application. Stomatitis, the broader inflammation of the oral mucous membranes, responds to the same gargle application. The entire lining of the mouth bathed in the cool decoction, toned by the tannins, soothed by the anti-inflammatory compounds. The heat and rawness of inflamed mucous membrane, meeting something that actively addresses both. Skin conditions, more broadly, have been treated with Vervain lotions. An infusion allowed to cool and applied to the affected skin. Eczema and the more general category of skin inflammation responding to the topical anti-inflammatory and astringent action. The same principle as the poultice, but in a more diffuse, less concentrated form suited to larger areas of affected skin. What is consistent across all of these external applications is the plant doing what it does internally, but at a surface, the same anti-inflammatory compounds, the same astringent tannins, the same antimicrobial action directed by the method of application to the site of need, rather than absorbed systemically to act at a distance. Verbena officinalis is the plant we are gathering tonight, but it has a close relative in the American tradition that deserves its own careful attention. Verbena hastata, blue vervain, taller than our plant, with deeper purple-blue flower spikes, native to North American wetlands and riverbanks. The relationship between them is not merely botanical. Their medicinal profiles overlap considerably. Blue vervain arrived in North American herbalism through the same dual stream we have traced for so many plants. Indigenous knowledge developed independently, and European settler knowledge brought across the Atlantic and applied to a new plant that resembled one already known. The internal uses of blue vervain in traditional North American herbalism cover the same territory we have mapped for Verbena officinalis: depression, fevers, cramps, jaundice, headaches, the same hepatic, nervine, antispasmodic, antipyretic profile. A different continent, a different species. The same cluster of applications arrived at through the same method of careful observation and accumulated experience. Externally, blue vervain compresses and washes were applied to acne, ulcers, and cuts, the antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory topical applications consistent with what the European tradition documented for its own species. Where blue vervain develops its own distinct character in the American tradition is in the personality typing that contemporary herbalists have developed for it. This is a mode of herbal thinking that matches plants, not just to conditions, but to constitutional patterns. The kinds of people who will benefit most from a given plant, based on accumulated clinical observation of who responds and how. The blue vervain type is described with a precision that I find illuminating, tense, driven. Holding rigid ideals, struggling to relax even when exhaustion is visible. The person who finds it difficult to let go of control, who carries their stress in their body as muscle tension and in their mind as relentless expectation of themselves. Who is, in the terms of the Western nervine tradition, the classic case of the person whose nervous system will not permit the downshift into rest that the body needs. This constitutional picture maps directly onto the irritated, driven, depleted state that the Western European tradition described for Verbena officinalis. The same type of person, identified by independent traditions working with related plants, as the one who most needs what vervain offers: the antispasmodic, releasing the tension they hold; the nervine tonic, rebuilding the capacity they have exhausted; the bitter hepatic, supporting the liver that has been working too hard to process the stress chemistry of their overextended lives. The long-term tonic use is emphasized in the blue vervain tradition. Specifically, this is not a plant for the acute episode, not something you take for 3 days and stop. It is a plant for the chronic pattern, for the sustained background of tension and overwhelm that has settled into a person's baseline, weeks and months of use, slowly shifting the underlying state rather than addressing any single symptom. That long-term constitutional use is entirely consistent with how the best herbalists in the European tradition have always used Verbena officinalis. You do not repair nervous exhaustion in a week. You do not shift chronic liver congestion in 3 days. You work with the plant over time, letting its slow, consistent action rebuild what prolonged stress has depleted. The bitterness of blue vervain is pronounced enough that contemporary practitioners often blend it. Tulsi for its aromatic warmth and adaptogenic quality, Damiana for its mood brightening and gently warming energy, Rose for its emotional opening and its affinity with the heart. These combinations both broaden the effect and make the tea more approachable for patients who find strong bitters difficult to sustain. This is good clinical practice. A remedy the patient will not take consistently does not help them. The art of combination is partly about broadening therapeutic range and partly about making the medicine acceptable to the person who needs it, the bitter and the aromatic held together, the medicine and the palatability balanced. The two Vervains, European and American, related but distinct, developed in traditions that had no contact with each other until relatively recently, and they arrived at such similar clinical pictures that contemporary herbalists moved between them with only modest adjustments for their respective characters. Blue Vervain perhaps cooler and more drying, Verbena officinalis perhaps slightly more focused on the hepatic, but both addressing the same constitutional pattern, the same nervous system type, the same underlying physiology of tension held too long. The plant, in both its forms, chose its people well, or the people chose the plant. The result, across centuries and continents, has been the same. The laboratory arrived at Vervain by the same route everyone else did, by noticing that the traditional claims were specific enough, consistent enough, and widely enough distributed across independent traditions to warrant systematic. What the laboratory found, when it looked carefully, was a plant of considerable pharmacological complexity, not a simple herb with one or two active compounds doing one or two things, a plant with multiple chemical families working across multiple biological pathways simultaneously, which is precisely what you would expect from a plant that the tradition had found useful for such a wide range of conditions. Begin with what modern research has confirmed at the broadest level: anti-tumor activity in tested systems, antioxidant activity, antibacterial and antifungal effects, anti-inflammatory activity. These four together form a profile that makes sense of the tradition's use for swellings, infections, fevers, and the chronic conditions associated with oxidative stress and persistent inflammation. The antimicrobial work is specific enough to name organisms. Vervain leaf extracts, particularly the kaffir derivatives, have shown activity against penicillium and rhizopus species. These are fungal organisms, mold species, the kind of pathogen that the medieval tradition would have described in terms of putrefaction and corruption. The apothecary prescribing Vervain wine against epidemics, the Anglo-Saxon leechdom using it against pestilence, the Ethiopian healer applying it to infections, all of them working, without knowing it in these terms, with a plant that contains compounds active against the organisms responsible for infection and decay. The anticonvulsant and anxiolytic research deserves particular attention. Preclinical studies on Verbena officinalis crude extract have demonstrated anticonvulsant, anxiolytic, and sedative-like effects in animal models. The anxiolytic finding confirms what the nervine tonic tradition has always claimed. The sedative-like effect, carefully described as sedative, like rather than sedative in the pharmacological sense, maps onto the traditional description of Vervain as a promoter of tranquility rather than a direct sleep agent. The anticonvulsant finding is more surprising to those who know Vervain only from its nervine reputation. But it is consistent with the antispasmodic action we traced through the menstrual and respiratory applications. Spasm is spasm, whether it is uterine smooth muscle or bronchial smooth muscle, or the electrical dysregulation of seizure activity, a compound that reduces the tendency toward pathological rhythmic firing is acting on the same underlying principle. The preclinical anticonvulsant data is early and requires clinical translation before strong claims can be made, but it is not inconsistent with what we already understand about this plant's character. Now we can name the compounds that have been doing this work for 4,000 years without being named. Verbena officinalis is rich in iridoid glycosides, phenylpropanoid glycosides, flavonoids, phenolic acids, terpenoids. These are the main chemical families, each containing multiple individual compounds, each family contributing its own range of biological activities to the overall profile of the plant. The iridoids are where the most specific research has focused. Verbenelin is the characteristic iridoid of this species, its name taken from the plant itself, as often happens when a compound is first isolated from a particular source, alongside verbenelin and hastaticide, named for the related species Verbena hastata. The compound that connects the two vervains, present in both, part of what accounts for their overlapping medicinal profiles. Then the related compounds, dihydroverbenelin, verbenicide A, verbenicide B, a family of related molecules within the same iridoid class. Iridoid glycosides are bitter compounds. They are responsible for much of the pronounced bitterness that we noted when we first handled these stems tonight. The bitterness that initiates the digestive reflex, stimulates bile production, acts on the liver. The iridoids are the molecular basis of the hepatic bitter action that runs through the entire tradition. They also have anti-inflammatory activity, have demonstrated effects on inflammatory pathways in tested systems, are likely to be significantly responsible for the anti-inflammatory profile that makes vervain useful for everything from throat inflammation to eczema to menstrual cramps. The bitter and the anti-inflammatory linked in the same molecular class, the taste and the action arising from the same compounds. Then the more recent discovery, verbenelinicides A and B, newly isolated compounds, described in recent literature as representing a novel ring system in natural products chemistry. Hybrid molecules formed from iridoid and phenylethanoid glycoside conjugates, with a structural arrangement not previously described in natural products. A plant in use for 4,000 years, producing a compound configuration that chemistry did not know existed until recently. That detail gives me pause every time I consider it. 4,000 years of use. Every generation of practitioners working with this plant, and in its chemistry, a structural novelty that we have only just identified. There is a humility required in the face of that. The tradition was working with something whose full complexity is still being mapped. Verbenelicides A and B, together with verbanilin and verbascicide, have shown hepatoprotective activity in human liver cell models. Specifically, these compounds were shown to rescue liver cells from ethanol, induce toxicity. The liver cells exposed to alcohol damage, then treated with these compounds, surviving better than those without treatment. The hepatoprotective claim of the tradition confirmed at the cellular level in human tissue with identified compounds producing the measured effect. Verbascicide is a phenylpropanoid glycoside, a different chemical class from the iridoids, contributing its own range of activities to the plant's profile. Antioxidant activity, anti-inflammatory effects, some evidence of neuroprotective properties consistent with the nervine tonic applications. The phenylpropanoids and the iridoids working in parallel, addressing the same underlying conditions through related but distinct mechanisms. The flavonoids contribute further antioxidant and anti-inflammatory activity. These are the compounds found across much of the plant kingdom, ubiquitous in the plant world's chemical response to oxidative stress, but present here in concentrations and combinations that add meaningfully to the overall pharmacological profile. Modern formulations sometimes standardize vervain extracts to iridoid content to a specific measured level of verbenelin, ensuring that a given preparation delivers a reproducible dose of the primary active compound class. This is the pharmaceutical approach to a plant medicine, the attempt to bring the precision of drug development to traditional herbal use. I understand the impulse. Reproducibility matters in medicine. A preparation of unknown potency is difficult to use with confidence in a clinical setting, but standardization captures part of the plant's activity, not all of it. The iridoids do not account for the full profile. The phenylpropanoids and the flavonoids and the tannins and the terpenoids are all present and all active and all contributing to what the whole plant does. Standardizing to one compound class while accepting variation in the others is a compromise. Useful for certain purposes, not identical to working with the whole plant. This is the ongoing conversation in herbal medicine between the reductive and the holistic approaches. Both have their value, The pharmacological identification of verbenolin and the vervalinicides gives us something specific to study, something whose mechanism we can investigate in isolation. That knowledge improves our understanding of how the plant works and helps us use it more precisely. But the practitioner standing in a field like this one, gathering whole plant material at the proper hour, is working with everything the plant contains, all of the chemical families together, all of the interactions between them, the full complexity that 4,000 years of traditional use has found clinically valuable. The compounds we have named tonight are a significant part of that complexity. They are not all of it. The plant, as always, is somewhat ahead of the analysis. It has had 4,000 years of practice at this. We have had rather fewer decades of looking at it through the particular lens of modern chemistry. The lens is valuable. The humility about its limits is equally valuable. The first light is beginning. Not visible yet in the sky, but something in the air has changed, a quality of imminence, the dark at its thinnest. This is the hour the tradition was always pointing toward. The threshold completing itself, night becoming what it was always about to become. And so the night has run its course. Sirius has moved across the sky. The bundles are gathered. The field is quieter than it was. And we have come a considerable distance further than the field, further perhaps than you expected when we set out. We began with tears, with the Egyptian belief that Vervain grew from the grief of Isis herself, from love made botanical, from the sacred insistence that some plants do not merely grow but arrive from somewhere. We followed it to Greece, where they named it hierobotane, the holy plant, where heralds carried it into enemy camps, and priests swept the altars of Zeus with its stems, to Rome, where it became herba sacra, where Jupiter claimed it, and Venus claimed it, and soldiers tucked it into their kit bags, and envoys carried it across battle lines, to the Druidic groves, where it was gathered precisely as we gathered it tonight, in darkness, under Sirius, with iron containers and careful hands and an understanding that this plant required approach. We learned that the Christian tradition did not discard it, it reframed it, herb of the cross, holy herb, devil's bane. The same plant turned to face a different sky. We learned that the Anglo-Saxon healer and the Welsh physician, and the Sussex cunning woman and the mother sewing a silk bag by firelight, all reach for the same stems for the same urgent reasons. We learned that Vervain crossed oceans in the magical tradition, that the Romani carried it, that the Simaruta amulets of Naples bore its flowers alongside Diana's silver. We learned what Dioscorides observed in the 1st century, what Hildegard mapped in the 12th, what Culpeper brought to ordinary households in the 17th. We learned that Chinese medicine used it against malaria, that Ethiopian healers applied leaf to ear and root to tonsil, that the Shawnee steeped it for vision, and the Iroquois used it cold against infection, that the Austrian tradition preserved it in tea and liquor, that the American blue vervain found its own tradition, its own constitutional type, its own place in the long story of careful observation. We learned what it does in the body. The liver stimulated and protected, the bile flowing, the nervous system steadied and gradually restored, the spasm released, the inflammation cooled, the depleted person slowly rebuilt. We learned the names of its compounds: verbenolin, astaticide, verbascicide, the verbenolinocydes discovered so recently that the ink is barely dry. We learned that the laboratory found what the tradition always claimed, that the hepatoprotective effect is real, that the anxiolytic activity is real, that the anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial and antispasmodic actions are real, that 4,000 years of practitioners were not imagining it. And we learned, perhaps above all, that this plant belongs to the threshold, to the in-between, that every tradition that encountered it placed it at the doorway between states, between night and day, between the sacred and the ordinary, between illness and recovery, between the world we can see and whatever lies beyond it. That its history is the history of the human need to mark what matters, to approach the important moments with intention and ceremony and the best plant in the keeping. The bundles we have gathered tonight will dry in the still room above the shop. They will find their way into jars and tinctures and preparations that will eventually reach people who need what they contain. Without knowing most of what we have discussed this evening, without needing to, the plant does not require you to know its history to benefit from it. It only requires that you use it with some attention. But knowing the history, I find, changes something. It makes the plant more than an ingredient, makes it a thread connecting you backward through every hand that gathered it in every dark field before this one. I hope you have found something useful in this evening's conversation. Perhaps an appreciation for a plant you had not considered before. Perhaps simply a few hours of quiet, of walking slowly through a dark field in good company. That too is a kind of medicine, and one I am glad to have been able to offer. The shop will be open tomorrow. The jars will be on their shelves. The counter will be ready. But tonight we were somewhere older than the shop, somewhere this plant has always preferred. If you ever find yourself in need of what it contains, you know where to look. And if you only want to walk quietly for a while in a dark field with someone who knows the names of things, the door remains unlocked. It always is, at this hour. To everyone who left a word in the comments, who told me where in the world you were listening from, thank you, genuinely. You are what makes this work worth doing. To everyone who shared this evening with a friend who passed the field along, thank you also. That is how old knowledge travels, the same way it always has, from one careful hand to another. I hope you are comfortable wherever you are. I hope the night is gentle. The bed is warm, the mind quieter now than when we set out. And if sleep has not yet come, I hope it is very close, waiting just at the edge of the next slow breath, ready to arrive, as the best things do without announcement. From this old field, with its dark stems and its older stars and its 40 years of quiet, accumulated work, good night. May Vervain watch over you. It has been watching over people since before the empires had names. It knows what it is doing